Tonight, we're going to dive into the darkest corners of human behaviour, the places that even seasoned detectives refuse to revisit. Alexander Spesivtsev, the Novokuznetsk monster, who turned his apartment into a torture chamber. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, the Montana predator accused of serving his victims as food to unsuspecting neighbours. And Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, whose crimes still haunt Russia to this very day. These men didn't just kill, they consumed, and what they left behind was a trail of horror that was so disturbing it challenges the very limits of what we call humanity. Andrei Chikatilo. He is a horrific monster of a man, so we're just going to go ahead, jump right on into the case of Andrei Chikatilo. And I think you're going to be horrified. I think you will feel physically sick. This man, complete asswipe. Now, I think it will be rather entertaining for a lot of you today as I ruin my life trying to pronounce the Ukrainian names of people, places, anything Ukrainian. I'm struggling out here. Okay, the struggle is real, but I'm going to try my best. And I have listened to howtopronounce.com, my bestie. And I should know them, but I know I'm still going to make mistakes. So hold my hand, walk through this with me whilst I do my best. Okay, so Andrei Romovich Chikatilo, he was born on October the 16th of 1936, and he was born in the village of Yabluchny, I said it the exact same. Yeah, we're going to go there. And that was in the province of northeast Ukraine. Now, at the time of Andrei Chikatilo's birth, Ukraine was going through a hard time. It was going through widespread famine. This was because of none other than Joseph Stalin. I could do a whole homicidal history, true crime and makeup video on that guy. Also, I just have to ask, why does Andrei Chikatilo look like that? What is wrong with that guy's face? And why he has a full set of teeth and yet he looks like he has no teeth? I had to go through his images because I was like, I'm sure this guy has teeth, but why does he smell like this? Why? Why is it? I've really made myself look bad there. No one screenshot that because I ain't having it, darling. So basically what Stalin decided to do is he would force collectivization of farms. So with Stalin, he basically forced collectivization of agriculture. The policy that he introduced, this aimed to integrate individual landholdings and labour into nominally collectively controlled farms. So this meant that any individual peasant farms would be replaced with collective ones, and he believed that by doing this would help the famine, that this would produce more crops and, feed Ukraine. However, what this did, with the collectivisation alongside a really bad harvest that they had, agriculture fell on its ass. People were starving more than ever because of the collectivisation of the farms. And this resulted in severe, life-threatening famine. Now, Chikatilo's parents, they were labour workers on collective farms and they lived together in this little one-room hut. I know what you're thinking, luxury, book us in. But it was terrible conditions. And you might be wondering, how much are they going to get paid for living in this tiny little shack that, barely keeps the heat in whilst they are doing labour work on the collective farm? Well, for their wage, they would receive, nothing, not a penny, not a single dime. They would get nothing in return. Well, maybe not nothing in return. They did receive the right to do some gardening or prepare crops in the little garden space behind their little shack. So there was something, but it was nothing. And as you can probably imagine, the Chikatilo family, they just struggled to make ends meet. It was rare that they would actually have a sufficient amount of food to feed their family. And Andrei Chikatilo himself, he said that he hadn't tried bread until the age of 12. I could not. I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. Absolutely not. I need carbs on carbs on carbs. No trying bread till the age of 12. I would inflate like a balloon the first time I tried bread because I wouldn't be able to stop. And the Chikatilo family, they would struggle so much that to curb their hunger on the days where they had next to nothing, they were eating grass and leaves outside their hut. They're doing it like the cows. They're just, down on all fours, munching away because that's all they could do. And I really do have to admit that Andrei Chikatilo's childhood was really unhappy. It was bleak at best, and even that in itself is an overstatement. He was extremely unhappy, he was lonely, and deep down he was harvesting this mass secret that his mother had told him as a child. So Chikatilo's mother, instead of telling, Andrei like little bedtime stories, talking about Little Bo Peep and the cow that jumped over the moon, she was telling him about a brother that he didn't even know he had, called Stepan. Now, she said that Stepan was born before Andrei was, and then when Stepan was just 4 years old, starving neighbours kidnapped him and cannibalized him for food. Murdering him, of course, because, they only left the bare bones, but cannibalized him for food because they were starving. Andrei Chikatilo is then living through his childhood thinking, when's somebody going to come and kidnap me and eat me? Horrifying. Now, I will say it's never been verified whether or not Stepan Chikatilo actually existed or whether this was a story conjured up by his mother Anna to try and keep him in line, which, bit extreme, bit harsh. Don't think any child needs to hear that. She told him that and she never ever denied it through his whole life. When Andrei Chikatilo was asked to sum up his childhood, he would offer 4 words: poverty, ridicule, hunger, and war. Yeah, doesn't sound great. Don't think I would sign up for that life. Now, Roman Chikatilo, which is Andrei's father, he was conscripted into the Red Army when the Soviet Union entered World War II. And at one point, when he was wounded in combat, he would be kidnapped or soldier napped by the other army. And once he was, soldier napped, they held him prisoner for quite a while, and God only knows what Roman Chikatilo went through and witnessed. Now, whilst Roman Chikatilo is, at war or held prisoner, who knows at this point, Chikatilo himself and his mother, they would witness the horrifying effects of the Nazi occupation throughout Ukraine. They witnessed bombings, murders, fires, shootings, and because they were so terrified, sometimes him and his mother would just be cowering in a ditch, hiding away from all this horrificness going on around them. And as we can all understand and imagine ourselves being in the same situation, Andrei Chikatilo was terrified. To put it lightly, he was absolutely terrified. Now, with his dad being away at war, this meant that Andrei could share his mother's bed, so he wouldn't be sleeping alone, and if he had nightmares, his mother's right there. But he was a chronic bedwetter. Yeah, he was just spraying everywhere. And one night, he accidentally peed all over his mother. And Anna freaks out, jumps up out of the bed, is shaming him, berating him, and even starts to beat him for peeing all over her. And listen, I get being a little bit crabby if you get peed over. Nobody wants to be peed over. No one wants a golden shower. And I get being angry, I get being a bit annoyed, but you don't berate and beat your child because they had an accident during the night. And whilst his mother was absolutely dreadful to him throughout this time when his father was away, Anna didn't have it easy at all. She was brutalised in many ways herself. At one point, Nazi soldiers were coming into this one-room hut and raping her, which then left her impregnated with Tatiana Chikatilo. Now, at this point, Andrei's father, he was still conscripted into the Red Army, so it wasn't him that got her pregnant, so she did fall pregnant from one of these rapes. And it hasn't been verified, but it is believed that Andrei Chikatilo did witness the rape of his own mother. So September of 1944 rolls around and Chikatilo would start school. Now, I have to say, his school life was no better, if not, it might even have been worse than his home life. Now, he was small in height, of course, he was undernourished, he was basically malnourished, to be honest, so he didn't grow to the stature that he should have by that point. And of course, with lack of food comes lack of energy. He was very weak, he couldn't really fight back, which made him a really easy target for bullies. And with all this coming into play, his stature, being short in height, being skinny, being a bit scrawny and really weak, that wasn't the main thing he got bullied for. The main thing he got bullied for was the fact that his father was taken prisoner during the war. They believed that his father was a coward who basically gave himself up and didn't want to fight back. Why is this young boy being punished for his father practically being kidnapped and then held prisoner during the war? He wasn't there. And I'm sure Roman Chikatilo doesn't tell that story with pride. I just realised I'm actually roaring. There's no need for me to be that loud. You're right there. Sorry. And of course, it's all right for some of the children in school who are being well fed, who come from better off families who can afford to, make purchases and things like that. But what they're forgetting is he was small, his stomach was bloated, he was a weak statured little boy because he was literally starving to death. Really, if he was left starving that long, he very well might have died. And even in school, he would faint due to starvation, and yet these bullies just kept coming for him. Now, despite Anna, the mother, being very berating and beating Tatiana and Andrei, Tatiana did say that Roman Chikatilo was a very, very kind man and a very great father. And to get away from the horrificness that he was going through at home, Andrei Chikatilo, he found himself really delving into reading, also memorising data. Teachers in his school said that he was an excellent student, he was a promising student, and probably one of the best that they had. At the age of 14 years old, he was appointed the chairman of the school newspaper. When he was 16, he was appointed the chairman of the People's Communist Party Committee. And even though learning didn't come easy to Chikatilo, even though he struggled to grasp certain subjects, he put so much effort and dedication into his learning that he would become excellent. He would be the only student from his collective farm to finish high school with excellent top grades. It was pretty amazing for him. We hate him as time goes on, but I can appreciate his childhood was difficult and really hard, but it will never excuse what he does in the future because he turns out to be a horrific, monstrous human being. But I can understand that his childhood was difficult and he went through things that no child should have to. Now, I'm not sure if it was, the pressure at home or school or the bullying from his peers, but over time, Chikatilo, he became extremely depressed. He was full of self-hatred, he was isolating himself, and he felt like he had to prove himself to other people, which he really struggled to do because redeeming qualities, there's not many. And then things got really hard for Chikatilo. Hard is probably not the right word. Things got difficult for Chikatilo when he was going through puberty because this is when he would come to the realisation that he was impotent. So he really struggled to get or sustain an erection. And this in itself caused deep levels of self-hatred and really made him isolate himself and have zero confidence. Now, when Chikatilo was 17, right, he falls for this girl, as we all do. We fall for people in high school and stuff like that. So he falls for this girl, but he was far too nervous to speak to her. And the fact that little Andrei wasn't working, that was going to let him down in the long run as well. So when he thinks he doesn't stand a chance with a girl his age, he would attack an 11-year-old little girl who was friends with his little sister. He wrestled this little girl to the ground, and then when she was struggling and squirming and trying to get away from him, kind of shouting for help, he ejaculated in his pants. Alert the people, this guy needs imprisoned right away, or, taken off the earth. But that's not my call. So Chikatilo, after this stint, he's like, damn, I better get the heck out of Dodge and, try and pull my life back together. So he applies for the Moscow State University. He passed the entrance exams with good to excellent grades. but these were deemed not good enough for entry to the university. So like how good do these grades have to be? Excellent to superior, possibly? I don't know. Or could they just sense that he was a weirdo and they were like, I don't want him on this university campus, because like I'd understand. You can tell me. So Chikatilo, he ended up working as a labourer for 3 months, and then he enrolled in a vocational school to become a communications technician. And it would be this very same year that Andrei was able to bag himself a girlfriend. However, the couple, they tried to have, sex, intercourse, coitus 3 times, and each time failed badly. Because Andrei couldn't sustain little Andrei, it basically, the relationship, it goes on for 18 months, and his girlfriend's kind of like, I think sex is an important part of a relationship. You're not really satisfying me because we ain't having it. Time to call it quits. I'm out here. I can't do this anymore. Which again is going to be so damaging to his sense of self-worth. And I just want to state as well that impotence, it's not funny. I don't find it funny. Like, listen, I'll slag off the bad guy all day, every day, but impotence is such a difficult, I nearly said hard again. Impotence is such a difficult thing for a man to go through, and it is isolating, it is humiliating, even though it shouldn't be, and it's not, but to the man, it is. And for a woman to end a relationship with a man because of this, that's only going to damage their self-worth. So then 1957 comes around and Chikatilo, he is drafted into the Soviet army. Now, he would perform his compulsory service from 1957 to 1960. After this was complete, he decides that he's going to move back to his native village and work alongside his parents on the collective farm. So whilst Chikatilo was back with his parents, he found a young divorcee that would really catch his eye, and he was like, oh my god, love at first sight, I want to be with this woman. So they would date for 3 months, but unfortunately, yet again, the relationship would end due to his impotence. The ego is bruised. The ego, I don't even know if it exists anymore. Now, what is really sad in this situation is this girl who he was dating, she had went to her friends to get some advice regarding the little Andrei situation, and her friends just blabbed to everyone and anyone, and then suddenly everyone knew Andrei's secret and was talking behind his back. And he was so ashamed by this that he tried to hang himself. He tried to kill himself, and it's just awful to think that people thought that was a funny thing and like something to laugh and joke about when it's really not. But also, like, if we knew the monster he would turn out to be, I'm not sure I would have cut his rope down, but that's just me. In 1963, after his little sister introduced him to this woman, he wound up marrying a woman by the name of Feodosia Odnicheva. And as much as Andrei himself was very attracted to Feodosia, this was ultimately an arranged marriage by his sister and her husband. But, Andrei's taking it because no one else is lining up to marry him. Now, lucky for Andrei in this case, Feodosia, she was really understanding about his condition, his impotence, and she knew that sex would be, basically non-existent or rare, if that. But she really liked him and she was willing to make the marriage work. And when the couple did want to have children, obviously that was a real struggle on Andrei's part because he couldn't get hard. But what he decided to do is, although he couldn't get hard, he was able to ejaculate. So he ejaculates over his fingers, and I can't believe I'm saying this on camera. He ejaculates over his fingers and then inserts them into Feodosia, and she fell pregnant. Crazy stuff. Like, wow. So swimmers work, but the mechanics don't work, But yeah, 1965 rolls around and boom, Feodosia pops out their baby. And 4 years later, boom, out pops another baby who was conceived in the same way. So these babies were called Lyudmila and also Yuri. And I have to say, the name Yuri just makes me think of Call of Duty. Love Call of Duty, but yeah, I can hear Soap McTavish shouting on Yuri right now. Yuri! Kind of sounds like him. Or it kind of sounded like Ozzy Osbourne as well. Sharon. No, Sharon. Don't know. So let's just hop back a second to 1964. Andrei Chikatilo, he would enroll at the Rostov University, where he would obtain his degree in Russian literature and philology. Now, he was able to obtain these by 1970, and then he went on to get a teaching job, which, you know, is kind of in the realms of what he wanted to do. Sort of. So he started working as a teacher at a vocational school, and he was working as a teacher of Russian language and literature. So a good job. I have to be honest, Andrei Chikatilo, he was not a good teacher by any means. Like, he knew what he was teaching, but he couldn't effectively teach. He couldn't engage his pupils to make them want to learn, and honestly, they just kind of mocked him, like made fun of him, and he could not keep a classroom under control for love nor money. So I've seen me looking around, I thought I seen my cat, but I don't. Spirits. One of Chikatilo's main jobs whilst working at this vocational school was to make sure at night all the children were in their designated dorms. Now, he loved this because he was hoping at the time that he went to check on the students, maybe they would be getting undressed and redressed for bed. And he would often peek in through their windows, trying to look through cracks in the doors, just to see the pupils naked. Now, one time when Chikatilo is perving on these students, he sees two students having sex, girl and boy, and he became furious and enraged. And the reason for this was because a 17-year-old was doing something that he, as a 30-year-old male, could not. That's what infuriated him. Now, in May of 1973, this is when Andrei Chikatilo would commit his first known sexual assault on one of his own pupils. This was a 15-year-old girl. He grabbed this 15-year-old girl and he starts to grope at her breasts. He grabs her genital area. And when she's struggling to get away and trying to push him off and, you know, beg him to let her go, this is when he would ejaculate. And it seems at this point the only way this man can ejaculate is when he is causing harm and inflicting pain to others. And this issue would only be exacerbated over time. And then just months later, after this horrific attack on the 15-year-old girl, he would attack another young girl and beat her after he locked her in his classroom. And how this gummy creep was getting away with this, I don't know. And the thing is, when he wasn't attacking his own students, he was playing with himself in the classroom whilst the students were near him. And the teachers knew about this. They even witnessed it, and yet he wasn't punished. Andrei has little Andrei out in the class fiddling away in front of these pupils, underage pupils, nothing being done. Now, even though the teachers had witnessed this and decided not to punish him, ultimately children were complaining to parents, parents were then complaining to the school, and this left the school with no other option but to say to Andrei, listen, you either resign or you're fired. And I think you can guess what option he chose. But ultimately, that school should have took the proper action. They should have called the police and they should have gotten charged. Why are they letting him dictate whether or not he gets in trouble for his hideous actions? So Chikatilo, he chooses to resign, and this didn't really matter too much because he had another teaching job lined up 47 miles away from Rostov. Now at this point, Chikatilo said that he had a very strong, insatiable desire to see children naked. He would loiter and creep around public toilets hoping to see young girls naked, and on 3 occasions, he was able to sexually assault young girls. Now, can you believe it? But in 1981, Chikatilo, he would be fired again after reports of child molestation of little boys and little girls. So like, why are we not calling the popo? Get the popo in, get him arrested, get him charged, get him convicted. Please. However, him being fired didn't matter too much to him because the following month he would get another job at a supply factory in Rostov, and this job required a lot of travelling, which you should definitely remember for this case. He travels a lot. It would then be on December the 22nd of 1978 that we realise just how evil Andrei Chikatilo is and just how far he will go to satisfy his own sick urges. So on the 22nd of December, Andrei would lure a 9-year-old little girl by the name of Yelena Zakotinova to an old hut that he had secretly purchased. Now, once they were inside this hut, Andrei immediately jumped on this little girl and attempted to rape her. But he couldn't get little Andrei working. You know, I will just say this little girl will be murdered, but I am so glad that this monster did not get the opportunity to rape this 9-year-old little girl. Now, devastatingly, as Yelena struggles underneath Andrei, he proceeds to choke her until she is completely unconscious, stabs her 3 times in the abdomen, and just to make sure, he chokes her again, just to ensure she is completely out cold. And then he throws her in the Grotesque River. Her body would be found 2 days later under a bridge. And listen, there was a ton of evidence that linked Chikatilo directly to Yelena's murder. There was blood spots on the fence facing of the hut that he had purchased. He had been in this hut on December the 22nd, the day that she was murdered. Yelena's backpack would be found on the opposite riverbank, and Chikatilo was described as the man seen talking to Yelena by eyewitnesses. However, it would be 25-year-old Alexander Kravchenko that would be blamed for this murder of Yelena. This Alexander is a complete POS as well, okay? He's not really a victim in this case. I mean, you know, it's a weird one, but he is an awful person just the same. So 25-year-old Alexander Kravchenko, he had served a previous sentence for the rape and murder of a teenage girl. Now, because he was known to the police, they decide that they're going to look at him. They're not going to look around and possibly find the real killer. They believe that he was responsible. Now, police search his home and they find blood spots on his wife's jumper that they said matched Kravchenko. Because of this, the police threatened Alexander and said to him, you know, if you don't confess to this, we will arrest your wife and lock her up in prison. Alexander didn't want this to happen. And due to this, he confessed to the murder of Yelena. He would go to trial for this murder in 1979, and during this trial he said that this confession he had made was made under complete duress and that he wasn't responsible for the murder of Yelena. Now, he would initially be sentenced to death, which was then reduced to 15 years, which was the maximum sentence at that time. However, there was a lot of backlash from Yelena's family, her friends, her peers, you know, teachers, everyone. Rightfully so, because this beautiful 9-year-old little girl, her life had been stolen from her. Now, because of the backlash that the investigators and police were receiving, the death penalty would be reinstated and he would be sentenced to death. So after he had been retried and convicted and sentenced to death, he was put in front of a firing squad in July of 1983 and died from a gunshot wound to the head. Now, Andrei tries to claim that during this time he was desperately fighting against his urges. You know, he didn't want to kill. He tried really hard to not kill. And he said that he would even come home early from business trips. Because he didn't want to find himself in a position where he might find another victim. Wow, how brave of him. So he's out here saying that he was really trying his best, but like, did he really try? I highly doubt it. Now, Larissa Tikashenko, she would be only 17 years old when she would encounter Andrei Chikatilo while she was waiting at a bus stop. And she would encounter him on the 3rd of September of 1981. Chikatilo, he was leaving a public library, and the minute he stepped out onto the street, Larissa immediately caught his eye. Now, Chikatilo, he approaches Larissa and he starts chatting away to her, you know, just making basic conversation. And then he says to her, you know, do you want to accompany me to a forest near the Don River where we can, you know, chill out, drink some vodka, relax, get to know each other? And Larissa at this point, because they've been chatting, she thinks, you know, this is a nice enough guy. Like, yeah, I could go a wee vodka, you know, I'll accompany you to the river. Devastatingly, Larissa would have absolutely no idea what was awaiting her or the fact that this would be her last day on Earth. So Larissa and Chikatilo, they head toward this forest, and as soon as they get there, almost immediately, Chikatilo wrestles Larissa to the ground. He starts ripping her clothes off, and then he proceeds to attempt to rape her. And luckily, he was unable to achieve an erection, so Larissa would not be raped. But when she started screaming and pleading with him to let her go and screaming for help, hoping that someone might walk by, he takes a handful of mud, stuffs it in her mouth to muffle the screams, ultimately choking her with this mud, and then he proceeds to beat and strangle her to death. And honestly, Chikatilo is like this wild animal, this wild predator who could not resist the urge to mutilate his victim. And he didn't bring a knife with him, so he looks around the forest and finds a 6-foot stick that he would use to mutilate Larissa alongside using his own teeth. He would bite off one of Larissa's nipples with his own teeth. And once he was done mutilating her lifeless body with that 6-foot stick, he buried her. Well, he barely tried to bury her. He covered her with some dirt and some leaves, and Larissa's body was found the next day. Please ignore the fact that I've just had to get my dressing gown on because I am absolutely stone cold. I'm freezing. And my hands are that cold that I'm just going to take a very brief break from doing makeup till my hands warm up, okay? So on June the 12th of 1982, and this was just 9 months after the murder of Larissa, 13-year-old Lyubov Birik, she was walking home from a shopping trip when she would encounter Andrei Chikatilo. Now, this was in the village of Donskoy. Chikatilo and Lyubov, they walk for around a quarter of a mile, and this is when they come to an area that's quite secluded. It's a secluded, wooded area, and devastatingly, this is when Chikatilo seen another opportunity to strike. He pounced on Lyubov and dragged her into this secluded undergrowth. When she was in there, he ripped the clothes off of her body. He proceeded to stab and slash her to death whilst he was dry humping her. He was pretending to have sex with her whilst he did this, just writhing up against her. What kind of sick freak are we talking about? Lyubov's body would be found on the 27th of June, and when it was examined, it revealed that she had 22 stab wounds to her neck, her head, her chest, her pelvic region, and she also had damage to her eye sockets. And Chikatilo, he would strike again on the 11th of December of 1982. Olga Stalmashinok, she was riding the bus to her parents' home, and it was on this bus that she would encounter Chikatilo. So she's chatting away with Chikatilo, everything seems normal, he seems nice, he seems friendly. Of course we know the truth, but Olga did not. And he was able to persuade Olga to get off the bus with him. A fellow passenger did report this creepy looking middle-aged man luring a young female off of the bus. And this man seemed to have a very firm grasp of Olga's hand. So Chikatilo, he takes Olga to a cornfield that's quite a bit away from the town, and when he's here, he would attack her. Olga had been stabbed around 50 times, again her neck, her face, her chest. Her chest had actually been ripped open and she had been disemboweled, so her intestines as well as her uterus had been removed. Now, a Moscow police team, they would be sent to Rostov in January of 1983. They were convinced that these 4 murders were all linked to the same killer. In April of that year, that is when the body of 10-year-old Olga would be discovered, and upon examination they seen that her eye sockets also had lacerations, just like the other victims, and they were 100% certain that this was the same killer. In June of 1983, Chikatilo again would murder a 15-year-old by the name of Laura Sarkeesian, and by September, he would kill another 5 victims. Now, due to the victims found and all the similarities around the wounds, the Soviet Union, they had to acknowledge with the public that a serial killer was roaming around. Due to the horrifying natures of these crimes and the disembowelment of the victims, police originally believed that this could have been the work of a satanic cult or an organisation that was harvesting organs to sell for transplant. Either that or a very mentally ill individual. And I'm not entirely sure how they got to this conclusion, but police believed that not only was this killer mentally ill and a paedophile, but they believed he was also homosexual. So authorities, they go ahead and they check everyone that has a psychiatric inpatient record or has been convicted of homosexuality or paedophilia. Now, they go through a list of loads of men and most of their alibis would check out and they were discarded from the list of suspects. Now, there would be many intellectually disabled young individuals who would come forward and confess to these crimes. But because bodies continued to be discovered whilst they were being held, they were ultimately ruled out. But the interrogation tactics that the police and authorities were using at this time was so vicious and heinous and hands-on that 4 people, 3 homosexuals and 1 sex offender, they committed suicide after their questioning. And whilst the police at this point are so extremely frustrated that they cannot seem to find this murderer, they were able to solve 95 murders, 140 aggravated assaults, and 245 rapes. So the search that they're conducting and the questioning isn't in vain. They are still helping solve these cases that have went unsolved for so long. So then on October the 30th of 1983, the body of 19-year-old sex worker Vera Shevkin would be found. It was determined that she had been killed on the 27th of October. She had been disemboweled and all the characteristics of her wounds matched that of the previous victims. And then on December the 27th of 1983, 14-year-old Sergei Markov, he would be lured off a train by Andrei Chikatilo and he would be murdered. And he would be murdered at the rural station of Novocherkassk. This 14-year-old boy had been completely emasculated. His penis and his testicles had been completely removed, and he had over 70 wounds to his chest and upper torso. 14-year-old little boy. How anyone can do this is just unbelievable. And then in January and February of 1984, Chikatilo would murder 2 young women in Rostov's Park of Aviators. And then on March the 24th, Chikatilo, he was seen luring 10-year-old Dmitry Pashnikov away from a stamp kiosk. Now, this incident would be witnessed by a man who was able to give a description of the middle-aged man that he seen with 10-year-old Dmitry. Now, Dmitry's body would be found 3 days later, and alongside his body, they would find the killer's footprint alongside their semen and saliva. And then again on May the 25th, Chikatilo would murder another woman. And then on May the 25th, Andrei Chikatilo, he would murder Tatiana Petrosian along with her 10-year-old daughter, Svetlana. Tatiana, she had known Andrei Chikatilo for years prior. Prior to these crimes, she had known this man and she got to know this man. She might even have trusted him. And then he murdered her and her 10-year-old daughter. Now, by the end of July, Chikatilo, he had killed another 3 young women and a 13-year-old boy. And in between all of these murders, Chikatilo gradually was letting that mask of his slip in public. He would be fired from his job for theft, but of course, he denied any thieving and any sticky fingers. He claimed that he wasn't responsible, but he'd resigned from his job anyway. But that didn't matter because on August the 1st, this sicko, somehow, he must have a good resume or somebody's lying for him because he got another job as a supply clerk in Rostov. And then on August the 2nd, Chikatilo, he would murder 16-year-old Natalia Golovskaya. And then just 5 days later, on August the 7th, he would murder another young girl, and this was 17-year-old Lyudmila Alexeyeva. She had 39 slash wounds to her upper body. She had then been disemboweled, and her body was found the very next morning. When she was found, her upper lip had been cut off, and when it was examined further, they found her upper lip stuffed into her mouth. Then on August the 15th, like as you can see, really escalating now, the days are getting closer and closer together, he would murder an unidentified woman as well as a 10-year-old girl, Akmarel Sedalieva. And just 2 weeks later, the body of 11-year-old Alexander Spesivtsev would be found. He had been strangled, he had been castrated, and his eyes had been gouged out. And his body was found just yards away from where Alexeyeva's body had been found. And then on September the 6th, Chikatilo would strike again. He would murder 24-year-old Irina Lushinskaya. Now, on September the 3rd, the police had caught wind of Chikatilo, who he was, the fact that he matched the description of the killer, and also the fact that he exhibited some very strange behaviour. So they put him under surveillance. So they witnessed him walk up and down the streets, trying to chat to young women, trying to chat to children. They even witnessed him walk up to young women and children and like grind little Andrei on their backs or up against their genitals or something, wherever he could stick it. So this is when they step in and they decide that they need to arrest him. Once they arrest Chikatilo, they are searching through his belongings and they found several lengths of rope. They found a knife with a 7.9-inch blade, and they also found a large jar of Vaseline. I only hope to God that this guy has some really, really dry chapped lips and that was simply all he was using that Vaseline for, but I highly doubt it. So get this right, this is crazy stuff. So Chikatilo, he had a blood sample taken from him and his blood sample would reveal that he was blood type A. Now from the semen that was tested at the scene, that blood type had come back as AB. Weird, right? Because we know it was Chikatilo, but how is he A and that's AB? Well, what the police didn't realise is Chikatilo is a non-secretor. So this basically means that blood group antigens cannot be found in saliva and semen. So the result determined is not going to be accurate. To determine someone like Chikatilo's blood type, they would have to have a blood sample. And if they were trying to determine it through, semen, they would have to take a direct semen sample, which they did not. So it looked like Chikatilo wasn't their guy because of this. So because of this, Chikatilo was ultimately, dog-eared. So folded down and kind of put to the side because he wasn't the killer, but he was really sus. But anyway, they arrest him and he serves 3 months in prison for stealing from his previous employer. Great stuff. Keep him in there. They don't, because they can't. And let me tell you, after this, Chikatilo, he just felt like he was invincible and he would proceed with his murder spree on August the 1st of 1985. And on this day is when he would murder 18-year-old Natalia Poklistova. And devastatingly, on August 27th, a young woman by the name of Irina Gulieva, she would also be murdered by Chikatilo. And both of these murders would be linked to the ongoing serial killer who was still roaming around. Now, because of everything going on and where the victims were being picked up, female officers, they were told to dress in regular day-to-day plain clothing and loiter around bus stations and train stations in the hope that the serial killer might approach one of them and they can determine who it is. A psychological profile was developed in the meantime to sort of give investigators an idea of the kind of man they were looking for. So it was determined that this man would be between 45 and 50 years old. He would be a recluse. He was determined to have suffered through pain and isolation in his childhood. They believed that he would be incapable of successfully flirting or holding down a relationship. He likely had a good education, he would be married and be the father of children, but he would also be a sadist who suffered from impotence. And it was said that his only arousal and sexual release could come from his murders. Now, they believed that because this man was impotent, the knife that he used was like a substitute for his penis, to get that, sensation. And they were also able to determine that this man must be someone who travels for work. Check, 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 check. Now, Chikatilo, like many of these sick sickos, he was obsessed with this investigation. He was following it very carefully when it was in the newspaper. He could not get enough of seeing his crimes on paper and no one knowing that it was him. Little toothless Tilo, he was just loving the attention. And this guy, honestly, just shows no signs of wanting to slow down whatsoever. August 18th of 1986, a 26-year-old secretary by the name of Irina Pogorelyova would be found on the grounds of a collective farm. Now, devastatingly, she had been slit open from her neck to her genitalia, and one of her breasts had been completely cut off. And not only had one of her breasts been cut off, but her eyes had also been removed. Then on May the 16th of 1987, Chikatilo again would murder a 12-year-old boy by the name of Oleg Makarnikov. And his body wouldn't even be discovered until 1991. Could you imagine his family having to live with that for 4 years, not knowing where their son has went? And then his decomposed body is found in 1991, knowing that he was laying out there for all that time. Just absolutely horrific. And in July of that very, very same year, he murdered 12-year-old Ivan Bielovetsky. And then on September the 15th, he would murder 16-year-old Yuri Tereshinok. In 1988, Chikatilo would kill another 3 times. One of these murders was an unidentified woman who had been bound and then gagged with dirt and had her nose cut off of her face before she was then stabbed in the neck, resulting in her death. So she was alive for her nose being removed off her face. I'm not sure how long through that she would be alive, but she was. And it's just horrific to think of somebody going through that torture and then their lives being taken away from them. He then proceeded to murder 9-year-old Alexei Voronko, another little boy, and then 15-year-old Yevgeny Muratov. He had been emasculated and had suffered from 30 knife wounds at least. On February the 28th of 1989, Chikatilo again would murder a young girl, and this time he would murder this young girl in his daughter's apartment. This young girl was Tatiana Ryzova. She was only 16 years old when she would be murdered by Chikatilo. Her body would be dismembered and then hidden in a sewer. There was another 4 murders between May and August. And by August of 1990, another 3 murders were committed. That was 31-year-old Lyubov Zuyeva, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov, and 11-year-old Ivan Fomin. And on the 6th of November of 1990, Chikatilo would commit his final murder. He would murder 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik. She would be mutilated and murdered in a woodland near Donlesko station. Thankfully, when Chikatilo had returned from the woodland he had took Svetlana from, an undercover police officer noticed him coming from these woods, and he thought it was strange. As he got closer, he could see a red smear on Chikatilo's face, and Chikatilo went over to a well, washed his face, and washed his hands. Now, as he got closer to the officer had noticed a really severe, large gouge in his finger. It looked like it needed medical attention, but Chikatilo did not seem in any hurry or panic to get it seen to. The officer had also noticed that Chikatilo's coat had grass stains and soil stains on it, and he was just finding it really weird that he had come wandering out of these woods that people really don't go into unless they're mushroom picking. And he was only carrying a nylon sports bag. You don't pick mushrooms and put them in a nylon sports bag, so what the hell was he doing in the woods? Now, Svetlana's body would be found on November the 13th, and the police officers, they're going back through reports. They're looking at people they've spoken to. Chikatilo's name is one that pops up rather often. Now, police, they had checked with previous employers and previous colleagues, and they were able to determine that the places that Chikatilo would be working and travelling to lined up perfectly with the locations and dates of the murders. They would also be made aware of the assaults that Chikatilo had committed when he was a teacher, sexually assaulting and groping these young students. So from this day on, Chikatilo, he was placed under police surveillance, and by November the 20th, he would be arrested. Now, the reason he was arrested is because he was seen approaching women and children, trying to lure them away places. Where to, we don't know, and thank God. So once he's arrested and taken in, he was strip searched, and this is when the officers would see that severe wound to his finger. And Chikatilo's saying, no, that wasn't me at that station, Bud just interrupted me. Are you coming up, darling? Come on, you handsome boy. He's tired. He's been napping for hours on my bed. Anyway, so Chikatilo, he's like, wasn't me at the station with the injured finger. You've got that wrong. Wasn't me. Blah, 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 blah. However, they were able to determine that severe injury to his finger was a bite mark. And this bite mark had come from Viktor Tishashenko. Now, Chikatilo's bone had been broken in his finger, and his fingernail had been completely removed. And this was an injury that did require medical attention, but he never went to get it treated. So police, they go ahead again and they test his blood type, which of course came back as type A, not type AB like the semen found at the scene. However, they decide, let's do a semen sample. Let's see what that comes back as. It came back as type A, B. Yep. They had a match and they had their creep. So on November the 29th, Dr. Buchanovsky, he was brought in to assist with the questioning of Chikatilo, and just 2 hours into the questioning, Chikatilo burst into tears. This guy was reading his psychological profile and stuff to him, and he just couldn't handle hearing about himself. So Chikatilo admitted to 36 of the 38 murders that had been committed and linked to this serial killer. And he would provide detailed accounts of each crime that he committed, and if he was probed, he could even sketch where the crime had took place. The police asked Chikatilo, why did you gouge out the eyes, or why did you destroy the victim's eyes? And Chikatilo had explained that he was worried that if he didn't destroy their eyes, there's Bud, but he was worried if he didn't destroy their eyes, that his image would be imprinted on them. This murderous image would be imprinted on their eyes and then bring the police to the killer. Him. He even admitted to tasting his victim's blood. Ugh. Creep of the week, I know. And he also admitted to chewing on the testicles and uteruses that he had removed from his victims. Are you helping? Are you telling the story? Now, Chikatilo did also state that on multiple occasions he would swallow the nipples or tongues of his victims. Oh, Bud just climbed up. Yeah, down here, baby. On November the 30th, Chikatilo, he would be charged with these 36 murders, and over the course of a few days, he confessed to 20 more. He would ultimately be charged with 53 murders. So Chikatilo, he went to trial on April the 14th of 1992, and he was put in this iron cage in the corner of the room, and this was basically to protect him from victims' families or outraged members of the public. Low-key, I'd leave it unlocked and I'd tell them, you know, do your thing, do whatever you want to him. He deserves it. And we know that, you know, Chikatilo, he likes to reveal himself. He loves little Andrei getting showed off to the world. So he would expose himself a lot in court, and he would also sing socialist movement anthems throughout the proceedings. Like, the judge was trying to talk, defence, prosecution trying to talk, and he's just like, nah. I know that's not going to be an anthem, but like it could be. Thankfully, on October the 14th, Chikatilo, he would be found guilty of 52 of the 53 murders, and he would be sentenced to death. Chikatilo, as they always do, he submits appeals all the way up till 1994, every single one being rejected. And then on February the 14th of 1994, he was taken from his prison cell in death row, and he was put into a soundproof cell in the Novocherkassk prison. And then he was put in front of a firing squad, and he would be killed by 1 bullet to the head. And of course, as always, before we end this video, I do want to bring it right back round to the victims, do a whole 360, talk about the people who actually matter in this case, and that is them. Not Andrei Chikatilo, not the evil, horrendous monster that took the lives of these innocent people. The victims are the people we should be remembering from these cases, not these horrific, awful monsters. And as usual, I just want to send love and prayer to them and their families who have to live with the knowledge of what happened to them. And for the pain and suffering they endured, I am so sorry that you had to go through that. He blended in. He threw cookouts for neighbours. He would feed them meat that he claimed he had hunted himself. But years later, investigators, they would finally find out the truth, or at least enough of it to stop them from being able to sleep at night. With missing children, chilling diaries, and a freezer full of secrets, this is the bone-chilling case of Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. So it might shock some of you, or it might shock absolutely none of you, that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he wasn't born with that biblical name, okay? He was born very normal, very regular, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this whole name change, we're going to dive into it later. But all you need to know right now is that he was originally born David Paul Brown. He was born on February the 15th of 1957. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he was the youngest of 3 children. So Nathaniel's father, or, you know, David's father, as we should say at this point, he had a job fixing planes, and his mother, Tyra, Well, she tried her best to fix everything else because this household, chaos. Now, when Tyra was just 3 months pregnant, she would be in this horrific crash. She had been waiting at a red light when another idiotic driver came right up behind her and smashed into the back of her car. And this whole ordeal meant that Tyra would be left wearing a neck brace for 6 months of her pregnancy. And I'm not being funny, having a baby is expensive enough. The appointments, expensive enough. On top of this, now this woman has chiropractic bills. I don't even want to imagine the cost. And you would honestly think that a mother who has been through a traumatic pregnancy, who has suffered that kind of injury and that experience, surely when the baby's born, she deserves a break of some sort. But when David Paul Brown arrived, a break just wasn't on the cards for any of the family. This was a baby who didn't like to be touched, he didn't like to be held, he didn't like to be looked at, he didn't want to move around, he just wanted to be fed constantly. His appetite was described as being completely insatiable. This baby was one that was never ever full. The minute you unplugged that bottle from his mouth, it was like you unplugged his frickin' life support. He was desperate for food. And I do not mean this in a judgmental way whatsoever, and this is what people have stated who knew David, but as a baby, because he constantly had to be fed to keep him quiet, like he was being overfed, okay, let's be real. And with that, he ballooned very quickly to the point where this little baby kind of winded up looking like a human beanbag. And unfortunately for him as a child, because he's been overfed, because he's constantly been handed a bottle or handed food whenever he cries, he balloons up so quickly. His little bones and muscles, they can't even cope with the weight gain. And his walking was deemed to be delayed due to this. His parents had to constantly carry him around because he wasn't strong enough to hold his own weight. He would be described as a screaming bowling ball by those around him at that age. And not only this, but even when he was just 3 weeks old, he would experience hydrocephalus, and if you don't know what that is, it's a condition where fluid builds up in your skull, and with that it puts pressure on your brain, which is a really horrific thing to experience, and I can only imagine how awful it would be for a little baby to experience. And it wouldn't be too long after his birth that his family decided, you know, maybe the nice humid weather in Florida will chill this baby out. So they head off, they take off to Lantana, Florida, and they would remain here for around 6 years whilst their dad had worked at a company, McDonnell Douglas. And this sounds like a dream, right? You've got sunshine, you've got palm trees, you've got golden sand. It sounds like the place to be. But baby David Paul Brown, the beanbag, screaming, crying, throwing up, throwing a tantrum. He just did not like anything other than food. He also still hates any physical contact, which is not great because he has to be lifted up everywhere he goes because of the weight on his muscles. And the minute he's lifted up, he would cry, but the minute he's put down, he's also gonna cry, so nothing's really changed. Then in 1964, the family, they would move back to Worcester of Massachusetts because his dad, he had a bit of a career change and he decided he wanted to get a job as a heavy equipment mechanic. Now, I have to say, David Paul Brown, or Nathaniel Bar-Jonah as he goes on to call himself, he would look back and he would blame his dad for an awful lot of things in his life. He said that his father was this really strict disciplinarian with a thick leather belt, and if you spoke back or if you disappointed him, he would beat the crap out of you. Now, according to Bar-Jonah, the reason his dad was beating him growing up is because his father genuinely, apparently believed that he could beat the gay out of him. His dad was said to be absolutely terrified at the thought that his son might grow up to be gay. He might be a homosexual. That, in his dad's mind, was the worst scenario, which is really ironic because I think what Nathaniel Bar-Jonah goes on to become, that's the worst scenario. And I will just never understand why we can't just let people be who they are, grow up to be whoever they want to be, love whoever they want to love. Why is it such a freaking big deal? And why do we all act like it's any of our business? Because it's really not. But anyway, so his dad's beating him all the time apparently, and pair this with the fact that at this young age, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah He's already a kleptomaniac. He is stealing from neighbours. He's stealing from siblings. He's stealing out front gardens in the neighbourhood. He was like this tiny little criminal mastermind. So it's not exactly a recipe for a peaceful household when neighbours are coming and complaining that little Nathaniel Bar-Jonah Sticky Fingers has stole their garden gnome again. But I will say, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he could have been acting out as a child because his father was apparently abusing him. You know, children deal with things in different ways. I mean, come on, adults deal with different things in different ways. This could have been his outlet, the way that he coped. But his father would never want to view it like that because in his eyes, his son was always a problem. I do have to say, in July of 1964, just right before they moved back north, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he is 7 years old at this point. And this is when he would test drive his future crimes. He would invite a 5-year-old neighbourhood girl to come down to his basement. He told this little girl that he had a Ouija board that could predict the future. If she follows him, they can play with it. Bearing in mind this is a 7-year-old boy, and he is literally calculating how to kidnap a little girl. Once he gets her downstairs in this basement, he starts to choke her. Now thankfully this little girl, she's able to scream for help. Whilst he's trying to choke her, she is screaming, she is wailing, she is pleading, and his mum would burst in and come to her rescue. But if she hadn't, that scenario could have been so different. And whilst his mum has burst in and rescued this little girl, there was no consequences. None at all for Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. Not even a slap on the frickin' wrist. This family, they just sweep this little strangulation incident under the rug and then they take off and head back to Massachusetts. And as he gets older, as you can probably imagine, this terrible, awful behaviour just continues to level up. By the age of 15, this weirdo, he's creating ransom notes out of like magazine cut-ins. Do you know how you can do like, if you do a scrapbook, you cut out the different letters, or the kind of things that detectives pin up to the cork murder boards and films. He was making these. And then he offers 2 younger boys $20 and a surprise if they come and meet him in the cemetery. And he wasn't just out here making the ransom notes. He was trying to kidnap these 2 boys. Thankfully, the young boys, they would be found, and the mums, they didn't press charges because they believed what this 15-year-old needed was some kind of psychiatric help. They think this is what would help him, what would fix him, but spoiler alert, no it wouldn't. In May of 1974 in Connecticut, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he would go on to try and kidnap a 9-year-old girl by the name of Mary Patron. When he is trying to kidnap this little girl, she is terrified, she screams, she kicks, she begs, she pleads like the little girl before. And because she's drawn so much attention to the situation, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah absolutely poops his pants and off he runs, which, thank goodness, that little girl was okay. But yet again, there was this other chance for accountability and responsibility to be taken by these onlookers, but nothing was done. So then it's March of 1975, he is 18 years old. He's legally grown, but emotionally he's prehistoric. He would impersonate an officer to kidnap an 8-year-old child. This 8-year-old child was Richard O'Connor, and he would be kidnapped on his way to school. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he gets this little boy and he would sexually assault him. Not only this, but he strangles him within an inch of his life, and this little boy, he obviously loses control of his bodily functions. He is absolutely terrified. I mean, anybody would be. But thankfully, a neighbour, they see this kidnapping take place and they immediately call the police to get this little boy help. Thankfully, a patrol car would patrol the area and they eventually find what looks to be this abandoned car just kind of hidden away in a corner. Quite clearly, it's someone who doesn't want to be spotted. When the officers look into this vehicle, they would see 8-year-old Richard. Thankfully, he is alive, but he is very near death. He is bloodied, it's clear he's been strangled and assaulted, and the police, they immediately call for backup. Now, the abductor and kidnapper of this little boy, you know, witness statements would describe him, but police were unable to locate who it was. And Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he has come so close to being caught, you would imagine that, you know, he would want to behave. Maybe he's learned his lesson. But oh hell no. A few days before his high school graduation, Bar-Jonah decides that the way he's going to celebrate graduating high school is to try this all over again. So this day he drives to Hartford of Connecticut again, and this time when he's here, he would abduct a 9-year-old girl. When he abducts her in his vehicle, he would sexually assault and physically attack this little girl, so much so that she starts vomiting, she starts convulsing. When this little girl starts convulsing, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, this is when he goes into complete panic mode. He doesn't want to get in trouble. He's just doing the thing that makes him happy, being a frickin' lowlife scumbag. He would open the door to this moving vehicle and throw this 9-year-old little girl out like she was something disposable, like she was garbage. Thankfully, a witness, they see all of this taking place. They see him throw this little girl from the moving vehicle. They note down his license plate and they immediately call the police. Now, thankfully, in this case, he is arrested and it looks as though he's going to suffer proper consequences now. But honestly, the police shouldn't even have wasted their time arresting him, because in May of 1976, he was released on parole. After what he did to this little girl, this monster, free to go. He even got a letter from the justice system thanking him for his cooperation. As if he had just volunteered at a charity bake sale. It is frickin' insane. And honestly, it seems like at this point, the authorities are going out of their way to become some of the most reliable enablers I've ever seen. And then we come to September of 1977, and has Nathaniel Bar-Jonah learned any lessons? No, he's absolutely not. Because somehow on September the 24th of this year, he is able to completely out-delusion himself. He is going to cosplay now as an FBI detective. He is then able to convince 2 younger boys to leave a movie theatre in Shrewsbury of Massachusetts. He convinces them that they need to come with him. He has questions for them. These boys come outside. They get in this beast's car. He then drives them off to a remote location where he proceeds to torture the both of them. And again, I'm not judging anyone by weight. I do not judge anyone on how they look. But believe me, if you're a serial killer, serial predator, a low-life scumbag, you're fair game. I'm sorry to say it. This man stands at £375, okay? Compare that to the body of a young child who is of an average weight for their age. Someone who is £375 versus, I don't know, 120, 130, 140, whatever, they're going to be very able to overpower the smaller person. This monster, he would repeatedly jump on the chest of one of these boys, trying his very best to kill him. He continues jumping on this younger boy's chest, and he finally thinks that he's killed this little boy. And is he remorseful? Does he get scared? Is he sorry? Absolutely frickin' not. Instead, he tosses this child aside yet again like they're garbage, and then he drives off with the other child locked in the trunk of his car. And thank goodness, but that first little boy, the one who had his chest jumped on, the one who was left for dead, he wasn't dead. At one point, he regains consciousness. He gets up and he is able to get help. He goes to the police. And he is able to describe exactly who done this to him, the kind of car that they were in. And Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he would get caught yet again. And they would find the second child still alive, but still locked up in the back of his trunk. And it seems at this point that the authorities, law enforcement, the justice system finally opens their eyes and finally thinks, you know what, we should probably do something about this guy. He's no good for society. So Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he is convicted of attempted murder. He is handed the maximum sentence of 18 to 20 years in prison, which, let's be honest, that's still not enough. But we will accept anyone at this point. So he is within Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Concord. And whilst he was here, he would attend therapy, and within these therapy sessions, he would reveal a lot. He starts to tell the prison psychologist about these dark and depraved fantasies that he has. Extremely graphic and extremely violent sexual fantasies. And you would honestly think with the level of detail that he was going into that he is convinced he is auditioning for some kind of low-budget horror movie. And when all of this is revealed to the prison psychologist, they're like, what in the fuck? Like, above my pay grade, this weirdo needs to be elsewhere. So he is transferred over to Bridgewater State Hospital to undergo psychiatric treatment. Whilst he's there, he is assessed, and they come to the decision that this guy, he's not ready to be in society, and they give him an indefinite sentence. This means that they don't know how long he could be there, but they know that it's going to be for a long while, possibly indefinitely. Also, I don't know if I confirmed there, but this place was a facility of psychiatric care for criminals. And so Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he would sit here in this state hospital, at least for a while. This fully grown, fully depraved, sadistic monster. At this point, after Nathaniel Bar-Jonah has been able to terrorise Massachusetts long enough that he gets himself a VIP seat in hell for all eternity, he decides he needs a rebrand. So remember, it's probably confusing because I've been calling him Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, but up to this point, he's actually been David Paul Brown. But it's now, he wants to rebrand, he wants to mix things up, change it a little bit. And I suppose it makes sense because when your life is one long rap sheet, the problem must be your name, not your shit actions, just your name. I'm sorry, my best friend just texted me something hilarious. Oh, right. Anyway, back to the story. So it's March the 22nd of 1984, and this is the day that David Paul Brown decides to jazz himself up a bit, and he becomes Nathaniel Benjamin Levi Bar-Jonah. And honestly, I mean, this is a name that's so dramatic that I can actually hear its own music cue. You know what I mean? But when he was asked why he changed his name to this, he said that he wanted to feel what it was like to be persecuted as a Jewish person. He said that he wanted to face the discrimination that Jewish people faced. Almost like oppression is this funny little playful costume that he can cosplay on the frickin' weekends. When people are literally living through hell. Now, I am going to jump ahead ever so slightly because I just need to reference a 2008 interview with this evil, deluded scumbag. So he was interviewed on Most Evil and he was questioned about his name. And he had basically said that he was Jewish and that he just wanted his name to reflect that, to reflect the fact that he was Jewish. And this would make sense if literally anything about this man supported that claim. Because, let me tell you, his ancestry, Scandinavian, his upbringing, Assemblies of God, Pentecostal Church, his involvement with Judaism, limited to filing out the legal document to change his frickin' name. This man wanted cultural credit without doing any of the reading, any of the studying, or having any actual identity beyond this predator who constantly lies. And you know what? I don't know how this worked, right? But somehow later in 1984, this rebrand that he has works in his favour. Because this rebrand, alongside two psychologists, wins a parole hearing. And why, you might ask? Well, that is because they claim that he is no longer a danger to society. Despite all his, disturbing sexual fantasies and the fact that he's actually now been talking about cannibalizing humans, he's out here writing fan fiction novels on it, but hey, he's not a danger to society. They basically stamp his report card with gold frickin' stars and show him the door. And the Superior Court Judge, Walter Steele, he agrees with this. He said that the state of Massachusetts failed to provide any evidence that would point him to be a danger in society. Which is absolutely hilarious because, the evidence piled up against him already could fill a frickin' warehouse. But hey, the state proved nothing apparently. And I want to look into this Walter Steele. Is he a relative? Because why would you want that monster free? If you have children of your own, why would you want that monster free? Riddle me that. Thankfully, there would be some clerical delays that, sort of delay the process, and he wouldn't really walk free until July of 1991. So we've bought some safety time, but not enough, because this monster should never have seen the light of day, ever again. And I know, with the crimes that this freak show has already committed, that your jaws are probably on the floor thinking, how the hell is this weirdo walking free? But do me a favour, pick your jaw back up the now and allow me to drop it again. Because whilst his release is being pushed through, he is still undergoing his treatment, shall we say, okay? He's still meeting with his psychiatrist. And he is still telling this psychiatrist that he has dark sexual fantasies. He has fantasies of murdering and cannibalising children. Yes, he is still having these sick fantasies. He is dreaming of cannibalising children, of eating children. And he talks very openly about this as if he's discussing his hobbies at the weekend. Now, another psychiatrist, they had noted that it was very clear that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah had been into torture since forever. They had also stated that violence was his primary source of sexual excitement. So in other words, this cretin, he's not rehabilitated, he's not better. He is just waiting for the opportunity to be around another child. So then, barely a month after his release, on August the 9th of 1991, Bar-Jonah would spot a 7-year-old boy that really caught his attention. This 7-year-old little boy, he was sitting in a car alone outside the Oxford, Massachusetts post office. Let's bear in mind, this is a big guy and prison hasn't trimmed his appetite. I don't know if he was stealing somebody else's candy bars, but this is a large man against a 7-year-old little boy. He opens the door to this vehicle, he climbs in, and do you know what he does? He would sit on this child's chest. And this man's weight alone is a weapon against this tiny child. This little boy is being suffocated under his weight. Now, thankfully on this day, the universe must be looking down and thinking, nah, you know what, not today. This young boy's mother runs out of the post office and sees what this animal is doing to her son. She runs screaming towards her vehicle, screaming at this weird cretin to get off of her son. And Bar-Jonah freaks out, flees the scene. This woman immediately reports him to the police, and by luck, an officer recognises that description. He knows immediately, that's Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. I know that man. I know how people describe him. They know that he's been causing horrors since frickin' puberty, and they immediately move in to arrest him. So when Bar-Jonah's arrested, the police are obviously questioning him, like, why the hell did you do this to this child? Why the hell were you trying to crush them underneath you? And Bar-Jonah's like, no, you've got it all wrong. You've got it all wrong, officer. What happened here? It was drizzly outside. I never had an umbrella. In the rain, it was getting heavier and heavier. I seen a car door unlocked and I jumped in to get out of the rain. This weirdo literally went, no umbrella, no problem, opens the car door, hops in, sits on top of a child. Did he not see the child? Surely he knew that child was underneath his ass. But you know, just crush a child to stay dry, that makes sense. Now, thankfully, the police, they aren't buying that at all, okay? So they keep pushing, they keep questioning, and eventually Bar-Jonah admits, you know what? You got me. I wasn't trying to get out of the rain. I intended to kill this child. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to guess what the justice system thought was an appropriate punishment for this attempted murder. And if you guessed that they would allow him to plead guilty to assault and battery, which, let's be honest, is the legal equivalent to a slap on the wrist, or maybe even a tap on the wrist. I don't even know if that's a slap on the wrist. And the icing on top of the cake, the cherry on top of the bakewell, is that his sentence is 2 years probation for attempted murder, but they allowed him to plead guilty to battery and assault. 2 years probation. He has already been convicted of attempted murder in the past, but 2 years probation, that'll cover it. Not only does he get sentenced to probation, which, oh my goodness, is a horrific sentence for Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he also has to promise, has to give his word that he will go and live with his mother in Great Falls, Montana, because there is no punishment than going back home to your mummy. So yeah, apparently, you know, no concerns for public safety, or, you know, if there is, they're just going to use the cheapest way to mitigate that and just send him elsewhere. So he packs his bags, packs up his cannibal fantasies, his fake weapons that he uses to cosplay as a police officer or FBI detective, and heads away to live with Mummy, ready to hunt yet again in this fresh, unsuspecting community of people. And it is this point that we come to 10-year-old Zachary Ramsay. So it's February the 6th of 1996, and this is when 10-year-old Zachary Ramsay, he is leaving his apartment in Great Falls of Montana around 7:34 a.m. And this morning routine that Zachary carries out is the same routine that he carries out every single day. This is his usual morning rhythm heading to Whittier School where he attends. And as always, taking the shortcut that he takes every single morning. Now, this was an alleyway near the 400 block of North 4th Street. That was a real tongue twister for me. And this little boy, he is dressed in one of his favourite outfits, and it's a typical outfit that any child would wear. He's got on a denim jacket, it has green sleeves, he's got his football jersey that has gold stitching on it with his name on the back. He's wearing the stonewashed jeans with his black high-top sneakers. And off he sets for his day, his normal day that should have been mundane, it should have been repetitive, but it wouldn't be. And this little boy would vanish and he would never come home. Now, there was a family of 3 who lived upstairs in an apartment that was overlooking that alleyway, and they had said that they did see Zachary head off for school that day, so he definitely took his regular route. But not only did they witness him walking through this alley, they also spotted something far more sinister, and that was an off-white 4-door car that nearly ran the little boy over. There would be another witness who reported seeing him standing in the alleyway all alone. Then there was another family who were closer to the end of that alleyway. They said that they had seen Zachary standing crying, and that there was also an upset, angry, obese man just a few feet behind him. And this was around 7:45 a.m, which would track for how long it takes him to cut through the alleyway. And this adult male that was spotted at the scene, this would be the most chilling part. There was another witness who would come forward who personally knew Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, and they stated that they seen him standing at the side of a dumpster within that very alleyway from around 7:15 a.m. That to me tells me that he was either waiting for an opportunity, or what I think could be true is that he has been stalking young Zachary, checking his route, making sure that he never deviates from the same route, and that he has waited there on him, knowing what time he would arrive. And not only this same witness said that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah was wearing a navy jacket, one that could be mistaken for that of a police officer. And we know this is exactly what this monster does. And it was somewhere in this very alley where Nathaniel Bar-Jonah was standing, somewhere between 6th and 7th Street, that young Zachary Ramsay would disappear. Now, school officials, they very quickly realise that Zachary Ramsay hasn't made it to school that day. They are extremely concerned because this was a young boy who always turned up. So they contact his mother, and his mother tells them, no, he definitely set off for school this morning. I watched him leave. He headed toward his normal route. He should be at school. Immediately, she is concerned because this is not like her son. By the afternoon, she has reported her 10-year-old son missing. Now, Detective Bill Belushi, he would be handed the usual sex offenders register because, unfortunately, with the witness statements that are coming forward, it is terrifyingly likely that this young boy has been abducted. Now, when he reviews the sex offenders register, there is a lot of names on it, but I'll tell you what name isn't on it. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. But with the witness statements, the kind of person that they're describing, even before the personal witness comes in that knows Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, Belushi's radar's already up. He is already the number one suspect to this detective. So Bill Belushi, he sends officers out to the property that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah lives at with his mother. They try to get entry by asking her if they can come in, but she would tell them no. So Bill Belushi, he goes ahead and he's trying to get a search warrant for the property, and this search warrant would be denied. So he tries again because he is convinced that this is the man they need to arrest. And it would be denied again despite Nathaniel Bar-Jonah's history. Now, very shortly after that second search warrant was denied, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he moves out of his mother's house. Very quickly, very abruptly. And you can't tell me that this timing was coincidental, because to me, what this is an escape. So now, if you can believe it, we're jumping ahead to December the 13th, 1999. Yep, because he was able to evade capture yet again. Now, on this particular day, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he was spotted yet again standing outside an elementary school for the third time in a single frickin' week. And you might not be surprised to hear that he was sporting his navy jacket that is a bit police-like. He had a knitted cap. He was also carrying 2 cans of pepper spray because, hey, who doesn't need pepper spray outside an elementary school? He also had a toy gun and a badge. Pretty much the costume of someone who is obsessed with security and the police, or, someone who actually wants to impersonate and have unwitting victims believe they're the police. Thankfully, at this point in time, Bar-Jonah is actually being watched. So the minute the police find out and Detective Belushi finds out that he is outside an elementary school for the third time in a week, carrying very strange items, they decide to move in. So he is originally charged with impersonating a police officer and for carrying a concealed weapon. And it's at this point that a judge would finally grant a search warrant, not only for Bar-Jonah's new apartment that he moved into, but also for his mother's house. This was all approved and ready to go by December the 15th. So the police, they start conducting searches on both of these properties, and they were immediately alarmed with what they would find. In the first instance, the thing that really tipped them off was they found 2 jackets. Inside the pocket of one of them was a fake police badge. There was also another toy badge that was laying nearby. They also found a stun gun, and then they find another cap that says security enforcement. But this was only the start, because when they go into his kitchen, they would see a ceiling mounted pulley. Something that suggests that something heavy might be hidden up there. And then they find 2 photo albums with cutouts of children. There was also a document about bondage, knots, autoerotic asphyxia. In case you're not familiar with what that is, but I'm sure you are, because we've covered autoerotic asphyxia in so many of these cases, and I'm sure you've heard it elsewhere as well. But it's basically when someone cuts off the oxygen supply for sexual arousal. People have actually died doing it because it's so freaking dangerous. But it was very clear to police that this man was either writing, directing, or starring, or doing all 3 in his own horror show. Now, when police are finding all of this, they really start thinking about Zachary Ramsey's case again, and they just think, you know what, I think we've made a grave mistake. I think we have overlooked this man when we really should have been pushing further. So they start digging into the Ramsey case, with Nathaniel Bar-Jonah being their prime suspect. When they do this, going back to the date that Zachary Ramsey disappeared, the police very quickly realise that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, that day, he had access to his mother's vehicle. What is his mother's vehicle, I hear you asking? Well, it is an off-white 4-door 1978 Toyota Corolla. What did that witness see in the alleyway? Ah yeah, a 4-door off-white vehicle. Now, the reason they know that he had access to this vehicle was because his mother was out of town at a funeral that day, and when they cross-check records, they also discover that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he wasn't working that day. And he also hadn't been working the days before, so if he was to, stalk a victim, he had plenty of time in his hands. Now, just 2 days after the property seizures, Detective Belushi, he wants to make sure he is doing everything by the book. So that first warrant they had was for the weapons and the things for impersonating a police officer, etc. So he obtains a second search warrant, and this one is for photographic material, documents, things of that calibre. And what they would go on to find in Bar-Jonah's apartment, it's just beyond horrifying. They would find a list, and this list was titled Lake Webster. On this list was the names of 54 young boys. Now, these boys, some of the names were boys from Bar-Jonah's youth back in Massachusetts. There was the names of the 3 younger children that he had abducted back in the 1970s. And then there was one name in particular that really stood out to the police. That was the name of Zachary Ramsay, and beside his name, they seen the word died. They were also able to amass dozens of newspaper articles, documents that had been cut out surrounding the disappearance of Zachary Ramsay. Hundreds of thousands of photographs of young children. Then as they continue to dig through his apartment, they would find undeveloped film. And this film contained a naked Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, which must be a horrific sight to see in itself. But there was also 3 naked, unidentified little boys. Now, a former roommate who had briefly lived in the apartment with Bar-Jonah, he said that he remembers seeing clothes that directly matched the description of the clothes that Zachary Ramsay was wearing on the day that he disappeared. The jacket, the jeans, the high tops, everything. And not only this, but this former roommate also found bloodied gloves. There was also another former roommate who would say to police that on a lot of occasions, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he would randomly bring Zachary Ramsay up in conversation, not just after his disappearance, but before his disappearance. And apparently, according to a former roommate, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah said to them, Zach Ramsay, he will never be found because he was chopped up and his parts have been scattered. Like, I know we don't know how people act in these situations. We don't know if people take these claims seriously at the time, but why the hell would you not at least bring it up to someone else or to the police? Because quite clearly this is a monster right in front of you. But I know we can't say that because we don't know what we would do in those situations, and we can only hope that we would do what we deem to be the right thing. But it just seems now, looking in hindsight, and hindsight's 2020, it's a great thing, but looking back, it just seems so obvious. Now, detectives, they also find notebooks that had Bar-Jonah's handwriting inside, and it seemed to be written in some kind of code. Now, the FBI, they do try and decode this, but it would take a long time. And when they finally are able to, these written statements is Bar-Jonah describing torturing, murdering, and eating children. This weirdo had even written out recipes that contained children's body parts. There was one recipe that had actually been titled Little Boy Pot Pie. Like, I'm so, this is a whole different level of depraved that we're discussing here. Then finally, on July the 5th of 2000, Montana police, they would finally charge Bar-Jonah with the murder and kidnapping of Zach Ramsay. Not only this, but also of 3 other children. He would be held at Cascade County Jail, and whilst he was here, he would plead not guilty. He would say that he was innocent, that he is being framed, that the police have it out for him, that he's changed, that he's reformed. Honestly, Bar-Jonah, tell someone who gives a tiny rat's ass. So because he's pled innocent to all charges, of course this is going to go to a trial, and the prosecutors tell the defence, we will seek the maximum. We will seek the death penalty. When the Montana courtroom finally has this monster right in front of them, trapped with nowhere to go, no kitchen pulleys, no fake guns, no badges, no mummy's house to escape to, the prosecution, they don't hold back. He was being prosecuted for abducting and molesting 3 young boys at this point. And these charges, they were stacked like a true crime frickin' Jenga tower. Kidnapping, aggravated assault, sexual assault, all told with stomach churning detail, because what I have not told you is that in Nathaniel Bar-Jonah's journal, what he had been writing about was molesting and torturing these young boys whilst having them hung up on his ceiling. That pulley, that thing that looked like something heavy would be put up there, it was the frickin' children. And this case is absolutely horrific and it is heartbreaking, but the emotional gut punch would come when Zachary's mother, she would testify for the defence. Bar-Jonah's liars had convinced this grieving mother that Zach is probably still out there and still alive, and that it's likely in her best interest and Zachary's best interest if she testifies in Bar-Jonah's defence. And I'm sorry, but these frickin' lawyers, they should have their jobs, their titles, everything taken away from them, because what kind of monster does this? They had hoped that by bringing in this woman to testify against Bar-Jonah that it would create reasonable doubt. And it did exactly that. These jurors, they could not convict Nathaniel Bar-Jonah with Zachary's death because this mother had stood up and told the court that she believed her son was still alive, because she has been fed absolute BS from the defence. Then out of nowhere, in the middle of this trial, sat 36-year-old Mary Petrone. I don't know if you remember Mary, but she was 9 years old back in 1974 when Nathaniel Bar-Jonah tried to abduct her. Her memories were crystal clear. She knew exactly who that man was, and she pointed at him, essentially saying, that is the guy who tried to abduct me when I was 9 years old. In the legal system, when Mary points this monster out, the legal system basically shrugs because the statute of limitations had expired. And this loosely translates to the courtroom didn't care because it was too long ago. Someone kidnaps and assaults a child, but, too much time has went by, so we're just going to pretend it never happened. And you just wonder, how would people in a legal position feel if this was one of their children who had suffered that? Would they not want justice no matter how long it's been? And I know the people in the courtroom are not making up the rules, I know that, but it's just so frustrating. Now, despite this cretin Bar-Jonah being able to avoid a murder sentence, he would still stack up quite a big prison vacation. He would be sentenced to 130 years in prison. There was no possibility of parole, no more second chances, and no more states inheriting him like a frickin' cursed family heirloom. This horrifying man behind bars, he was still proclaiming his innocence, saying that he didn't do anything that he was convicted of, that he deserves to be free, that he definitely didn't murder Zachary Ramsey. And he would continue this all the way up until he took his last breath. But let's be honest, accountability and responsibility has never been a language that this man's been fluent in. And I have to say, this part here is really heartbreaking because Zachary Ramsey's mother, she held on to hope that her son was alive for so long. And it wouldn't be until 2011, despite her own objections, that a judge would finally declare Zachary Ramsey dead. A gravestone was put up for a child whose body was never returned. And this mother, she was broken in two. She believed that her son might come back to her one day, that there's that possibility, and she held on to the hope that he was still alive, because this is what she was told off Bar-Jonah's defence. Now, it would be discovered that years prior to all of this taking place, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, he was meant to be on the sex offenders register. I mean, of course he frickin' was. But there was a clerical error that meant he was never put on the list, and so he was never really looked into. Now, this case, it did put a national spotlight on that. The fact that some offenders are never registered. Like, how the hell is that happening? And this led to activists demanding that every sexual predator, every sexual offender are required to register. Every time, everywhere. And that none of these monsters slip through the cracks the way that Bar-Jonah did. And I'm sure it comes as no shocker to anyone that Nathaniel Bar-Jonah, the man who loves to avoid accountability constantly, he was appealing his sentence, and in 2004, luckily this would be rejected. There was no way this man was going to get out of prison. And that 130-year prison sentence that he was handed, that firmly stayed in place. And then on April the 13th of 2008, Nathaniel Bar-Jonah's reign of terror, this would come to an end. But it didn't end with justice. It only ended because his own body gave up on him. Guards found him unresponsive on the floor of his prison cell. They said it was years of overeating, his weight, there was heart trouble. Now, his health was rotten for a very, very, very long time. And his post-mortem would reveal a severe LDL build-up, very unhealthy cholesterol, and he had died of a myocardial infarction, which is basically just the medical term for a heart attack. There was no remorse, there was no apology to his victims or to his victims' families. Just a dead predator, decades far too late. But if you think we're done with this case, if you think we are done with this story, I'm sorry to tell you, but you are so far wrong, because we have more to dive into. Now, although Nathaniel Bar-Jonah was never actually convicted with the abduction or murder of young Zachary, the trail of evidence that was left behind, that just tells you that he was absolutely the culprit. And what's even worse on top of that, if it can even get worse, is investigators, when they delve deeper into this case, they believe that he is the culprit of so many more homicides. And this would be based on the discoveries made at his former residence. And it was his travel logs alone that read like the itinerary of a predator on tour. Massachusetts, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Wyoming, Michigan, Washington State, too many to frickin' count. Multiple states, multiple windows of disappearances. He had even lived in Canada at some point as well, and there was Canadian disappearances that lined up with the times that he was there. And then you get to the victims that were tied to his movements, and this is where the horror just deepens. On July the 26th of 1973, 7-year-old Janice Pocket, she would disappear from her home in Tolland, Connecticut around 3 p.m. She had went because she wanted to look for a butterfly in the woods. Less than half an hour later, this little girl's bicycle was found just half a mile from her home. Investigators fully believe that the murder of this young girl, the abduction, would have been committed by Bar-Jonah. He only lived 20 miles away at this point in Webster, Massachusetts. He would have been 16 at the time of this crime, but it was clear from the childhood that we've already discussed, his pattern was already forming. And honestly, hand on heart, I believe he could be the culprit. Then we come to August the 23rd of 1973. 15-year-old James Tita, he had left his home in Revere of Massachusetts around 11:30 a.m. Now, the reason he had left so early was because he had planned to hitchhike to Boston. Now, he would be seen 2 hours later near Government Center. But after this, radio silence. And then on August the 25th, the body of this young boy would be discovered. This young boy had been raped and strangled. Now, when investigators, they had sprayed a phosphorus chemical within Bar-Jonah's garage at the time they were investigating the Ramsey case, when they did this, the word Tita appeared. And this, of course, prompted authorities to believe that he was the one who would have killed and raped this young boy. And then we have September the 30th of 1978, a 4-year-old little boy, John Amato. He would vanish from the woods behind the trailer park that he lived in Webster, Massachusetts. This little boy had fallen, he had lost his toy, and he was point blank refusing to get up without retrieving his toy. And then by 10:30 a.m, this little 4-year-old boy had disappeared. And this case would later again be tied to Nathaniel Bar-Jonah. Now, there is another possible link on October the 13th of 1997, and this is to 14-year-old Amanda Dawn Gallion. She had set off for school in the morning around 7:15 a.m. from her hometown of Gillette, Wyoming, and she would never make it to school, and she would never return home. That very night, Bar-Jonah, he had showed up to a motel within Gillette, and by the next night he was back in Montana. Her bike would later be found next to Interstate 90, and it was confirmed that her social security number has never been used again. So this isn't a young girl who's ran away from home, who survived and just didn't want to be found. This is a young girl who has quite clearly been attacked in a way that means she will never be found. And then we come to the cannibalism that Bar-Jonah is suspected to have committed. Now, it's very important to note that even from the age of 6 years old, Bar-Jonah would pick his skin until it bled, until it scabbed, which I know can be a behaviour with OCD and many other illnesses. But when he would do this, he would pick and pick and pick until it bled, until it scabbed. When it finally scabbed, he would eat his scabs. I know, I'm sorry, I'm sure your stomach's turning, I hope you're not eating anything. He would eat his scabs and suck the blood from his arm at the age of 6. Teachers would phone home to his parents explaining that he was picking his skin and sucking his blood in class. When he's in the psychiatric institution, he is telling the psychiatrist that he is cannibalising on children, and no one really took it all that seriously. They thought it was a dark fantasy, but they never once believed that it was true. He had even expressed to his psychiatrist that he always wondered what human flesh tasted like, that he had a taste for it without actually knowing. And here's the other thing, here's the kicker, right? This man weighed around 375 pounds, okay? Give or take, I'm sure it went up and down when he was in prison, when he was in hospital, this, that and the next thing, sure. But his financial records showed no significant grocery purchase for an entire month after Zachary disappeared. This obviously raises a huge waving red flag because why not? A man who was always purchasing meat suddenly isn't anymore. And simultaneously, in this same month after Zachary's disappearance, where he's not doing big food shops, he's not going to Tesco and doing the big shop, it appears he is stocked up on meat. Enough meat that he starts hosting cookouts with his neighbours, feeding them hamburgers, chili, spaghetti, meat pies and casseroles. Guests had even noted that the meat that he used tasted different, it tasted odd, and we can only assume the worst from that. Bar-Jonah, he insisted that he had just been deer hunting, that he got a deer, he had butchered it himself, is that the word, butchering it? I don't know. But this man, he never owned a rifle to hunt deers, he never had a hunting licence, but that's the last of my worries because he doesn't exactly play by the law, but he never owned a rifle to hunt these deers. And there was never any record of him deer hunting, not once. One woman who was at this cookout who tasted this meat, she told him that it tasted repulsive. And he said to her, "That is probably because I murdered, butchered and wrapped it myself." And has he just been this killer in plain sight that is messing with people because he can? Or was it truly a deer that he's just cooked terribly? We'll never really know. But this same woman who had told him that his meat was repulsive, she also later claimed that this man, this freak, molested her own son. Now also, something else that we need to look at is his employment history during the time that Zach had disappeared. He had a part-time job working in a kitchen at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Now, investigators, they had speculated that possibly he was using this position to get rid of evidence by feeding victims flesh to the Air Force. But they were never able to collect enough evidence to be able to bring a charge for that. And then we come to a search done at his previous residence. Authorities had excavated 2 tons of dirt from the garage, and they would find 21 fragments of human bone. Now, the DNA analysis, it did show that these bones were not a match to Zach, but they believed that these bones had belonged to an African-American young boy between the ages of 8 and 12 years old. And then the investigators, they think, well, do you know what? Maybe he's been flushing body parts. Maybe we need to look at the sewage pipes beneath. But when they go to do this, the new owner of the house, they tell the police that they had to have them replaced because they were so heavily clogged. And I mean, clogged with what would be the question. This case is truly and utterly horrific, and I am so devastated for the victims in this case who will never ever receive their justice because this man is gone. And it galls me to my very core that he died in a way that wasn't serving justice. My thoughts and my prayers go out to the victims' families, everyone affected by this case, affected by this monster. Every single one of them deserves so much better. They did not deserve to be caught up with this monster. I just hope that wherever these victims are now, that they are resting peacefully, and I hope that families have been able to find some sort of healing. Please remember the victims of this case. Please remember their names and their faces if I've been able to find photos, because they are the ones that matter. They are the ones who deserve their names to be spoken, not that evil cretin of a man. In the small Siberian city of Novokuznetsk, neighbours had grown used to the strange smell from apartment 357, and no one could ever have imagined what was lurking behind that apartment door. When police finally forced this open, they wouldn't just walk into a crime scene, they would walk into hell. Pots were still simmering on the stove, and the air was thick with decay, and scattered across the blood-stained floor was remains, butchered, cooked, and then left to rot. The man that lived here wasn't a monster out of legend. He was a real human being, and his name was Alexander Spesivtsev, and his story is one of the most disturbing, evil cases in modern Russian history. So I do apologise because I have a sneaky feeling, an inkling that this video might be slightly shorter than the other ones that I do, but this case is so freaking interesting. Trust me, you're gonna want to listen. And I don't know why, but going through this, well actually no, I do know why. This case reminds me slightly of Ed Gein, and not in the sense of, you know, everything that Ed Gein done. If you don't know what he done, I'll link my video. Don't watch the series Monster if you want to know what Ed Gein really did, because it is so freaking fabricated. And if anyone is going to be able to completely disrespect victims and their families, it's freaking Ryan Murphy. Like the whole storyline with Bernice Worden, if I was Bernice Warden's family, I would be right on the phone to my lawyer, because the way they painted that woman, it infuriated me, and I have no relation to her. But I was literally jaw-dropped at the fabrication of her storyline. And then there's The Voice, and I know they say like Charlie Hunnam, my apologies. I know they had said that he had like access to unreleased interviews and things with Ed Gein, but it was known that Ed Gein would put on this more childlike, soft-spoken voice to convey an innocence. If you listen to any other tapes, he doesn't speak like that. Like, there's no way Ed Gein was just chilling, being like, "Oh, mother says you're a whore." Like, no. It actually made for a really hard watch, that voice alone. I really struggled to listen to that voice, and the way that they painted him a victim more than his actual victims, batshit crazy. See if that was just a horror series and it had no relation to Ed Gein, fair enough. As a standalone series, okay, but the fact that you're saying the Ed Gein story whilst fabricating like, I don't know, 70% of it, kind of crazy. Okay, so now my rant really is over. Now I'll get into the case, but I just really had to get that off my chest. A lot of people have asked me what I thought of the series, and I did watch it. I watched it start to finish, which is ironic because I'm literally complaining about it, but it just really rubbed me the wrong way. And like, my boyfriend had no idea about Ed Gein, and he thought what was shown in that was fact, and I was like, honey bunch, let me sit you down and tell you the facts, because I'm not having you walking around telling Ed Gein's story like some kind of dramatised Hollywood freak show. Anywho, I will actually get into the case now. So, we're in Russia today, or Siberia, or are they the same place? I always get very confused. I should have fact checked that. But if there is anything that the 1990s was good at, that was producing chaos, especially in post-Soviet Russia. The country was crumbling, the economy was completely collapsing. And in the industrial city of Novokuznetsk, one particularly charming young man, he was very slowly turning into one of the most disturbing serial killers that Russia would ever see. And the name of this man was none other than Alexander Spesivtsev. And let me tell you, like, the journey that we're in on today is just, it's too much. I'm not gonna lie, it is too much, and we've got a crazy ass mother in here as well. So although his name is Alexander Spesivtsev, he would be dubbed by the press, of course, as the Siberian Ripper, the Butcher of Novokuznetsk. And then there's a personal favourite, the serial killer who made Hannibal Lecter look like a picky eater. And I mean, he did, but, you know, it's like, do we need to talk about Hannibal Lecter? Also, you're going to hear me talk about Alexander and also Novokuznetsk multiple times, and each time I say them, it's probably going to sound different, okay, because I'm struggling. I am riding the struggle bus today. I do have the phonetic pronunciation, but I'm not convinced. So, here we go. Alexander Spesivtsev, he was born on March the 1st of 1970, and he was born in Novokuznetsk of Siberia. At this moment in time, it was a city defined by steel production, coal mines, and, as it would later turn out, the conditions that allowed monsters to develop and grow quietly and unnoticed. Now, when Alexander was born, he was born extremely underweight, and this was something that would affect him up to his adolescence. He ended up being chronically ill. Every single week he had a new illness, and he wasn't just trying to get a day off school. Like, this young boy was literally just going through hell. It's like his own body was battling against him. Now, his mother, Lyudmila Spesivtsev, she was a local history teacher, but honestly, that was the least interesting thing about this woman. She had managed to cultivate herself an image of someone who has expertise on the suffering of children, which is really ironic considering she would go on to enable and support the suffering of children, somewhat encouraging these unspeakable acts against children. Now, Alexander's father, by contrast, he was completely different. He was a struggling alcoholic. He was someone who, once they had a drink, became very abusive, which tale as old as time in these cases. He was emotionally distant, he was frequently absent from the family home, and he just seemed to be completely incapable of creating a safe and nurturing environment for his family. And to be quite honest, between the father and Lyudmila, this family home became a breeding ground for psychological instability. Now, Alexander's father, his drinking continues, it spirals out of control. He basically turns on his family and hates them. Lyudmila at one point, she's like, do you know what? I need you gone, which more power to her, get him out of the house. If he's threatening, if he's abusive, get him out. So she expels him from the family home, tells him never to return, do not come near his son, do not come near her. She was sick and tired of the alcohol, the abuse, what that was showing Alexander. But as soon as the father left the house, you would expect things to pick up, things to get better. And in Alexander's eyes, they did. But outsiders looking in, we can see what was really happening here. Alexander was now completely under the control of his own mother. A mother who almost groomed him. She was obsessed with him. She wanted to get her claws into this young boy from as early as possible. Now, to outsiders at that time, it just seemed like she was completely devoted to her son, that she was maternal. But we can see now when we look at the case that her devotion wasn't devotion, it was over-obsessive indulgence. Lyudmila completely isolated Alexander from any of his peers. He wasn't allowed friends. She overseen every aspect of this young boy's life. He had no freedom at all. He didn't get to do what the other kids did. Lyudmila would treat him as her fragile little prince for the majority of his life. Now, when it comes to Alexander going to school, at this point, all he knows is his mother. All he knows is that she is the only person that matters. She's told him this. It's them two against the world. So when he gets to school, he doesn't know how to act around these other children. He doesn't know how to interact, socialise, make friends, so he's completely socially isolated and awkward. Not to forget, he's chronically ill, so there's always something wrong with him. And the fact that he isolated himself, the fact that he seemed a little bit different from everyone else, that made him catnip to bullies. And we all know where I stand on bullying. It is such a scummy thing that you can do. You have no idea the damage that you do to someone when you decide that they're your target to bully. Like, sort your own out and leave people alone. Internally, Alexander truly believed that no one else in this world cared about him, only his mother, and he's been fed that his entire life so far, so of course this is what he is going to believe. In his mind, she completely doted on him, loved him, adored him, cared about him, wanted to make sure that he was safe and happy. She would reinforce to her son that society was cruel. She would simultaneously shelter him from any accountability that he would have to take against his own actions. And this goes right up to adulthood. And this created an environment for Alexander where he believes he is completely entitled and he has every right to resent everyone else in the world, bar his mother. See what I mean? It kind of gives Ed Gein, not completely, but a little bit. Now, something that we should know about Lyudmila, right, is she had an obsession with true crime. No, like us, like true crime's our jam, that's fine. We're interested. We want to see how these humans come to be, what causes them to do what they do. But Lyudmila, she was obsessed with corpses, how they died, did people get away with it? And this interest, it wasn't something that came out of nowhere. It's something that she had an interest in her entire life. But she wound up being fired from the school that she worked at as a history teacher because she was caught stealing. Lydemelia Stickyfingers should have been her name. So she was caught stealing plumbing supplies or something like that, which makes me sad because, you know, did she just not have enough money to get things fixed and had to resort to that? You never know. But fear not, because Lydemelia, she wouldn't be out of work for long. She was able to get herself a job as a secretary for a lawyer within a court. Now this role, this gave her access to incredibly graphic and grotesque crime scene images. Not only images, but she also got to take home reports to review and read over and over and over again, and that is exactly what she did. But not only this, she would show these crime scene images. Bearing in mind this is people who have been murdered, she would show them to her son. She would explain what happened to this person, how their body ended up in this way. And Alexander himself, he winds up being obsessed with mutilation. And Alexander told his mother he found these absolutely thrilling. These images, they made him happy. And Lydemelia, she would do anything for her sweet little prince. So if gruesome, grotesque crime scene images make him happy, she's going to show them to him. Lydemelia actively encouraged this. She would bring home whatever she could find to show her son the bodies of these poor people who have lost their lives in horrific ways. He was encouraged to look, to read about this, to completely immerse himself in this world. Now, neighbours, they had recalled Alexander as being a pale, withdrawn, socially awkward child who apparently made people nervous because he would stare at them for so long that it was almost like he was staring into their soul. And they said that the gaze that he would hold with them for so long was so uncomfortable, and they could almost see like this inner turmoil that he had going on. Classmates said that Alexander began sort of like scribbling in his notebook. He would do this obsessively, constantly, all the time. No one was allowed to see inside his notebook, which, you know, I mean, we all have like journals and stuff like that I'm sure we don't want people to see, but he would get angry, and I mean like attacking people angry. This uncontrollable rage would come upon him if someone even just like hovered over his shoulder a wee bit. Not only that, but any minor provocations, they would just cause him to erupt into this unimaginable rage. Teachers wondered, how can a child of his age contain so much anger? Where does that come from? Probably from all the graphic crime scene photos and knowledge that he has on these murders that are going on. But hey, let's not blame the parents. Even though in this case, I'm definitely pointing a finger at Lydemelia. Now, by his adolescence, he had developed a very intense fantasy and obsession with all things violence, murders, serial killers, Nazi ideology, and this combination, the early exposure to graphic violence, social isolation, obsessive maternal attention, this created what I can only describe as this psychological cocktail primed for sadistic behaviour. Now, as Alexander starts to approach and go into his teenage years, Lydemelia almost grew stranger with her son, if that's even possible, because she is an absolute weirdo anyway. But she was bathing her son even when he became a teenager. And now listen, I absolutely know there are circumstances where teenagers might need to be bathed, but Alexander, he was able-bodied, he was able-minded. Lydemelia just enjoyed doing it, and Alexander didn't know any better because this is what he's had his whole life. Not only this, but she would force Alexander to sleep in the same bed with her. And this went up through his teenage years as well. And this isn't just a mother being overprotective, this is complete enmeshment, suffocating, controlling behaviour. And this will come as no surprise to any of you because we see it all the time in these animals. We can't even call them animals because animals are precious, animals are great, but we see it time and time again with these monsters. They start to demonstrate these very early signs of sadism, and a lot of the time that starts off with cruelty to animals. He would torture neighbourhood animals without any remorse. Neighbours' cats disappeared, Alexander was behind it. Any small animal he could get his hands on, particularly cats, small dogs, squirrels, anything of that nature, they were all fair game to him. And I'm sure that each of us can agree that this evil, vile, sadistic act of hurting and killing these poor innocent animals, that is one of the main red flags in the profile of a future serial killer. Think of it, McDonald triad. It's all in there. So, at the age of 18, Alexander, he would enroll in university, which honestly was kind of surprising to me considering he lives in his mother's back pocket, but hey. But at this university, he would only last a year. He would then drop out, and this just further deepened and intensified his resentment to a world that he believed already was just cruel to him. Bearing in mind the fact that he dropped out, but somehow it's everyone else's fault. Classic. Now, his mental health, it would extremely deteriorate, and eventually he would be diagnosed with schizophrenia as well as psychopathy. And of course, these are two conditions where someone requires a lot of help, a lot of treatment. But it would take for him to have a violent outburst before he would be institutionalised. Now, whilst he's institutionalised, his obsession turns to, how can I be horny all the time? And I'm sorry to say it, but that's how it was. He wanted to increase his sex drive. So much so, he had a fellow patient insert a very small metal ball into his urethra, all in the hopes to, stimulate little Alexander. I'm sure you can imagine that this did the complete opposite. He was in constant pain, he was in constant discomfort, and not only that, but he started to suffer from erectile dysfunction. Alexander, he was desperate to get out of this institution. He didn't believe that he belonged there. And luckily enough for him, the collapse in post-Soviet mental health system, this ensured that he wouldn't stay confined for long, and definitely nowhere as long as what he should have been. They were overcrowded, underfunded, understaffed, and with this, the hospital released him prematurely, as they did with so many others, completely untreated. They didn't have time to take the necessary steps with Alexander because, well, he was in and out. That's what she said, sorry, I had to say it, it was like bursting out at me. But not only was he untreated, he was then being released into the obsessive care of his mother once again. And it was safe to say that by the early 1990s, Alexander's psychological profile was complete. Paranoia, violent tendencies, sadistic impulses, social isolation, and a mother who normalised his behaviour. And now we are going to come to discuss his very first horrifying crime that he committed as an adult. One that he would basically get away with. So in 1991, Alexander, he would lure a young woman by the name of Eugenia Guselnikova, a young woman who was 4 years his junior. She would be lured into his apartment whilst his sister and mother, they had temporarily relocated. And the relationship between Alexander and Eugenia, this deteriorated so quickly that no one could have seen it coming. They had fought over something so minor and so trivial, but even this was enough to set Alexander off. He starts emotionally abusing her, and then he starts to beat her. Eugenia at this point is crying out, begging for him to stop. When he's not stopping, she shouts out and tells him, this relationship, what we have here, is completely over. I want nothing more to do with you. She couldn't be with someone like that, someone who would flip his lid at the slightest inconvenience or the slightest cross word. But with this, Alexander, he became even more frenzied. His attack became even more violent, even more scary, and he continued to beat her harder and harder. Eugenia would be kept here for weeks. He would physically and emotionally abuse her constantly over those weeks. She was locked up in his apartment with absolutely no way to escape. Now, I couldn't find the whole story of how Eugenia's parents found out what was going on, but luckily at one point they're able to intervene. Alexander's name was handed over to the police, and the police immediately make their way over to the apartment. But let's bear in mind here that Eugenia, she has been in there for several weeks, constantly beaten, constantly tortured by this monster. When the police arrive at this apartment, they could never ever have prepared for what they were about to see. This young girl was completely bedridden. She was suffering from all these pus-filled wounds that had developed on her skin from the beating, from the mutilation that he had put her through. This young girl fought for her life and eventually she died of sepsis. Now, an investigation would ensue, of course, and upon this they had discovered that Alexander, he had brutally mutilated this young girl's body in a ritualistic and sadistic way, so horrifically that her true cause of death could not be determined. They said that sepsis was a secondary cause, but that first cause couldn't be found. And this evil bitch, Lyodemila, right, I'm just saying it, she helps him clean this up. She cleans up the apartment, she cleans up this girl's blood, hiding evidence, destroying her personal belongings, all in the hope that her little Prince Charming son that she seems to think he is wouldn't get caught. Now, of course, she's arrested for this. She's tampering with evidence. She's helping to conceal a body of a young woman. But her defence was that she acted out of love, that she couldn't bear to see her son locked up in a prison. That's not what he needed. And unbelievably, in early 90s in Serbia, the police lacked the capacity to even be able to challenge her claims, and she received no sentence. Her punishment wasn't even a slap on the wrist. It was nothing. She wasn't punished. Now, Alexander, he was arrested, but he would not be sent to prison. The commission had deemed that he was mentally ill, and instead of prison, he would be sent to a real psychiatric facility. And whilst he was here, his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and psychopathy, this would be backed up by the doctors at this hospital. And in this chaotic institutional environment, he learned how to feign compliance, how to feign remorse. Now, staff had actually reported that whilst Alexander was in this hospital, he appeared to be very calm, very polite, and he even seemed to cooperate with nurses and doctors when it came to his treatment. But this was a mask that was concealing complete evil and danger beneath the surface. And this bit I honestly couldn't, well, I was going to say I couldn't believe it, but let's be honest, we can absolutely believe it because this is always what happens. Again, tale as old as time. But after just a few years, I think maybe actually just 2 years in the hospital, Alexander was considered to be improved and he would be released and sent home to live with his mother, Lyodemila. Now, Lyodemila had promised the hospital that whilst Alexander is home, she understands the rules, he must take his medication, he must do X, Y, Z. She agreed to it all. She wanted to see her son better. Did you really though, Lyodemila? Did you really? She was also told to watch out with Alexander to ensure that he was complying with societal norms and that he didn't have any strange hobbies. And did Lyodemila follow through on her promises? Did she enforce those rules? No, of course she didn't. And you know what is absolutely insane at this point in the case is when Alexander was released from the hospital, it was all done so quickly. They just wanted him out of their hair. So when he was discharged, there was no notes made about his discharge and the police were not informed that he had been discharged from the hospital. So authorities believe that this maniac is still locked up getting treatment when really he's just out to live a normal life. They had no idea, so they couldn't monitor him, they couldn't check in on him, because they didn't realise he was out in society. Now, when Alexander had first returned home, he had himself a job, and this was meant to be a really positive step in the right direction. But once he arrives home and really settles in, he seizes his work. He stops. Who wants to work? And in fact, who wants to leave home? So he isolated himself in this small apartment. Not only that, but he indulged in his violent fantasies completely unchecked. Now, neighbours over a period of time, they had reported hearing strange noises coming from the apartment. Loud bangs, shouting, screams. And the police, they visited multiple times, but Lyodemila answers the door and she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know where those noises are being heard. That just doesn't sound right to me. I'll make sure everything's under control, but there's nothing to worry about." She assured them that everything was fine and, they can just go back to their job and she'll keep the noise down. All to ensure that Alexander, her twisted little prince, wouldn't be taken away. And let's be honest here, the system has failed. The psychiatric oversight, the police, even society completely ignored this danger. So then we come to the mid-1990s, and at this point, Novokuznetsk, this was a city that was in a constant state of change. Crime was rising, social services were totally strained, and law enforcement at this point, they're just so overwhelmed. They don't have the manpower to deal with the rise in crime. And what nobody knew is that in one apartment, a son, and his mother. They were quietly preparing to escalate from personal violence to a spree that would mark them in Russian criminal history. Now, as you can probably imagine, Alexander's descent into complete terror didn't just happen in one single dramatic act. This was a crescendo, a build-up of everything over the years, built on psychological neglect, obsession, enmeshment by his own mother. By 1996, this man, he was isolated in this little apartment, his every move being enabled by Lyudmila. He was angry at the world and fueled by resentment, and again his mother is fueling this further. And it would be around this point that Alexander decides he wants to continue what he started before he was institutionalised. He wants to hunt for new victims. In early 1996, there would be 2 young women who would be his first targets confirmed post-institution. Now, I will say, because this is a case that took place in Russia, it's really hard to get the names that line up with each individual murder. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go through the cases one by one, or a couple at a time, depending on how they occur. And at the end, I will give a list of all the victims' names. I just don't want to tie any names to any cases that I can't confirm in case I get them mixed up. But these 2 young women, they would be lured back to this apartment by Lyudmila. She lured these victims to her son. When they were in the apartment, Alexander, he would launch a sadistic attack on them. They were raped, they were beaten, they were tortured, they were murdered, and then their bodies were dismembered. In this very apartment that he shares with his own mother, she knew exactly what was going to happen when she took the girls there, and she knew exactly what happened once they had been killed. And the thing is, Lyudmila, she never became scared of her own son. She knew how much he adored her, that he was the only woman in his life that meant anything to him, and she knew she was safe with him. And her love was completely unwavering no matter what he did, to the point that during the night, she would load up body parts and carry them down 9 flights of stairs just to dispose of them. This older woman, 9 flights of stairs, getting rid of body parts to protect this monster. She was burying these body parts in wastelands or throwing them into rivers. It is just crazy to think that regular mothers, they might help out with the shopping or the cooking, and then you've got Lyudmila, who is out there burying remains of victims, all to help her son. As you can imagine, her involvement, this would become a crucial piece of the case, showing not just the enabler behaviour that she has, but just how hands-on she was in the disposal of these bodies. And then by April and May of 1996, Alexander's crimes, they would grow in audacity and scale. He headed out toward a construction site where he ran into 6 young boys, all of them deemed to be around 12 years old. Now, he was able to lure these boys away from the construction site under the guise of committing petty theft. Alexander had claimed that he had keys to another apartment, and if these young boys followed him to said apartment, they could rob items, sell them on, get some money, which at this point in time is quite scarce. And as you can probably imagine, the only keys this loser held were the keys to his and his mother's apartment. There was no other apartment they could rob, and as soon as these boys were in this apartment, as soon as the doors had closed behind them, any notion of a playful adventure completely evaporated. Alexander would rape these young boys who of course tried to resist, who tried to fight back, but if any of them tried to fight back, they would just be stabbed to death. Soon after this, he repeats the same pattern on 2 young girls, 12 and 14 years old. This was all under the pretense of a business opportunity, of them selling soap to get some extra cash, an opportunity that never existed. And yet again, Lyudmila, she is right there with her bucket and her soapy water and a hacksaw to help dismember and dispose of these bodies, dumping their remains in a local river. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the depravity of Alexander and his crimes, this only worsened the more his emotional instability and mental instability had deepened. This apartment was a space of complete horror, complete decay. And the scarcity of food at this point in Russia, that only made him more unhinged. Alexander would begin feeding parts of his victim to to his dog. And in the most grotesque escalation that we could expect, he started to cook and eat the human remains. Later reports would describe his behaviour as clinical and methodical. It was almost as though this act of murder was a perverse routine that he had perfected. By June of 1996, bearing in mind there's only a couple of months that have went by in between all these murders, but by June of 1996, he had killed 4 more. 2 were young girls, 1 was a woman deemed to be around 40 years old, and another was a male that they deemed to be around 35. He had dismembered these victims, carving loin pieces with a level of precision that suggested both practice and pathological obsession with the process itself. July and August wouldn't slow down for Alexander. This only brought more victims. We've got 19-year-old Natalia. She would be killed in July, and then in August another 2 young girls. And it just seemed as though the escalation in these murders, even between the timelines, it was just rapid and systematic and terrifyingly organised. And it just seemed to paint the picture of someone with a mind of complete sadistic creativity and obsessive control. 2 of the worst frickin' combos you could ever ask for. And it would be the discovery of children's remains found in the Aba River that would finally alert authorities to the fact that there was a frickin' serial killer going around. Now, the victims who were found in the river, their ages had ranged from 9 to 14 years old. Police at this point, they decide the best thing to do is to start reviewing some records of previous offenders, but also those who had been institutionalised in a psychiatric facility. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt. Alexander's going to be on that list. But he wouldn't be, because his early and rushed discharge from the institution and the complete chaos of the period of time in which he was released, this meant that he had effectively vanished off the radar. Completely. Pulled a Houdini. Now, meanwhile, whilst this is going on, the city of Toliati, that would experience a wave of serial killings as well. Now, these were carried out by Oleg Ralkov, and if you want, I can cover that POS in a completely different video, but brutal, evil scumbag. But for a time, the authorities, they had mistaken that maybe he was the Novokuznetsk killer. However, once he had been caught and arrested, the disappearances and the murders, they kept taking place, so quite clearly there was another serial killer at large. Now, I think the final chapter of this man's killing spree, this really depicts the complete depravity of him. And it really demonstrates the full level of his cruelty. So Lyudmila, she had helped Alexander lure 3 teenage girls to the apartment. First off, we have Nastya. Then we have 15-year-old Xenia and 15-year-old Olya. The girls, yet again, they were lured to this apartment under complete false pretenses. As soon as they get into this apartment, they start to feel as though something's wrong, something's not quite right. These people suddenly have went from friendly and helpful to just completely demented. Now, Nastya, she tries to escape right away. She can just feel it. She tries to run. She gets to the door. She is grabbed by Alexander. She would be killed almost instantly when she tried to escape. In front of her friends have had to witness this brutal murder, knowing that this is the fate that awaits them. Xenia and Olya, they would then be chained to a radiator. And after this, the physical and emotional assault and torture that they would suffer through is just completely sickening. These young girls, these teenagers, they would be raped repeatedly. Not only this, they were forced to dismember their other best friend's body. They had to watch as pieces of their best friend was fed to the apartment dog. These girls endured daily beatings, daily rapings, coercion, everything that you can imagine that is evil and vicious, they endured. And they would be trapped in this real life horror movie for a month. Even Alexander's sister would come into this apartment, witness what was happening to these teenage girls, and she didn't say a word. She didn't contact the police. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't get help. She witnessed it, left it. And in my eyes, this makes her completely culpable. Neighbours would hear thuds, slaps, screaming, crying coming from this apartment, and they just thought, meh, must just be another crazy tenant having a meltdown. And they haven't even realised that there is young teenage girls being murdered in the apartment upstairs or downstairs or beside them. No one had suspected for a second that they were living next door to a sadistic, methodical serial killer. And thankfully, we are approaching the downfall of Alexander. And this downfall, it honestly kind of came by accident. No one had suspected him. No one had rushed to the apartment believing that he could be a murderer. But what had happened is there was pipe issues within the apartment building, and because of this, plumbers, they're called to the building, they need to do an assessment, figure out where the issue's coming from, and bingo, it's coming from Alexander and Lydemilia's apartment. Weird that. Now, Lydemilia and also Alexander, they refused the plumber's entry to the apartment. Something really shady, really shifty is going on. And the plumbers tell them, you know, this is a huge issue we need in your apartment, so you either let us in or we get the police. And they force their way in. And still, Alexander and Lydemilia, they stood firm. You are not getting in this apartment. And the plumbers think, well, fuck you then, that's fine. I'm going to go call the police. So the police, they arrive at the apartment, they force entry, and immediately, as they enter this apartment, the stench of rotting flesh hits them. They knew immediately that human decomposition had taken place, or is still taking place, in this apartment. And then as they start looking around closer, they notice blood over the walls, over the ceilings, and then there's a pot on the stove. Yep, and as we know, a pot on the stove in these assholes' apartments and houses, it is never a good sign. This pot was simmering, and inside was partially ate human remains. These were being het up and cooked again. Quite clearly, somebody had the intention of eating these. Then the police approached the bathroom, and I mean, I don't even know how they recovered from this, but in the bathtub, they would find the headless torso of a child. Other body parts of other children were stored nearby and also in the tank in the bathroom. Nearby the radiator, 15-year-old Olya, she would be found. She was mutilated, it looked as though her flesh was rotten, but she was still alive. Barely, but she was hanging on. She would be rushed off to the hospital, and the police, they keep looking through this apartment, and soon they would find a diary or a journal of Alexander's. And this diary, this detailed the murder of 19 young girls. Now, I will say he is suspected of being guilty of even more deaths than we can imagine, but they could only really investigate the names that they found. And what's so horrific is Alexander would tease the fact that he did murder dozens more, but Russian authorities at the time, they had lacked the funds to carry out further investigation. Now, going back to 15-year-old Olya, she makes it to the hospital, and she was able to survive for 3 days. But in the end, this young girl, she succumbed to her wounds. They were too horrific for her to be able to survive them. And while she is in hospital, while she is fighting for her life, she is still able to get the strength to give the police a statement, a witness statement, something that they need, something concrete. She had described how this man had introduced himself as Andrei. She told them about how her and Xenia were forced to cut up Nastia's body. She had stated that he never took any participation himself. He just barked the orders at these young girls and laughed at them whilst they did it. She had told the police how Xenia had been knocked so badly on the head that her head had split open, and that Andrei, Alexander, he had just grabbed a needle and thread, like your basic needle and thread, and attempted to stitch it up while Xenia writhed underneath him trying to get away. Now, I do have an exact bit of testimony from Olya, and I'm going to read that now for you because I feel like it's important to hear her telling through her own words rather than me just sitting here. So she says, "When Andrei killed Nastia, at night he ordered us to cut the corpse into pieces so that it would be easier to hide. He gave us a hacksaw for metal. With it we cut a corpse, cut meat from bones with a knife. He himself did not do this, he only commanded. He fed the dog meat and bones. Xenia and I carried the cut off parts to the bathroom where we put them in the bath and the tank. Both the grandmother and the woman saw it all. They were present in the apartment. All the rest of days he beat us, Xenia and I. He broke her hand, broke her head several times. He sewed her head himself with a simple needle and thread. And let me pose a question to you. Do you think this big mama's boy actually waited on the police breaking down the door and then faced the music? Of course not. This waste of oxygen, this waste of space. He fled from the apartment and he climbed right up to the roof and took off, so he didn't have to face any punishment, because these predators are so quick to inflict the most horrific, grotesque pain, but they are always so scared and chicken to actually face the music, to face the consequences of their actions. But fear not, because his freedom, very, very short-lived, because he came strolling back to his apartment one day, just loitered out the front, hanging around, and he was immediately arrested. The police were freaking waiting on him. Now, I must say, there is conflicting sources. So most sources state he was loitering around his own apartment building and then he was picked up by police. Others state that he actually got caught because he was trying to rape another woman in her own apartment. I can't say for sure. If you have more detail, more information, if you're from the area, please let me know. But most sources do state that it is the first one. Now, investigators, they are continuing their search throughout this apartment. And what they would find was just insane. They had recovered 80 sets of blood-stained clothing, mostly belonging to children. There was also jewellery, there was Polaroid photographs, and despite the fact that a full genetic laboratory was brought to Novokuznetsk by train, the total number of victims could never be fully established. Now, Alexander, whilst he is being interviewed and interrogated, he would happily admit to 19 murders. He was very open about them, he was pretty much detailed about the whole thing, but then suddenly he decides he wants to recant that statement, and what he'll do instead is claim insanity. However, the court would recognise this maniac as sane, and they would sentence him to imprisonment for the maximum possible time period. Now, shortly before the final verdict was passed, Alexander, he was scheduled to undergo another psychiatric exam. Now, when this took place, they had brought in the opinion of doctors from VP Serbsky Research Centre, and they had all come to the definitive conclusion that he needed to be in hospital. They had to change the measure of restraint. They said that this was the kind of person who wouldn't bode well in prison, they wouldn't do any better, they wouldn't rehabilitate, they actually needed medical help. So the Siberian Ripper, he would be transferred to a psychiatric hospital near Volgograd, and he still remains there to this very day. And then we come to Lyudmila, Satan's spawn, Satan's wife actually, because she is completely evil and twisted. When she's been interrogated, she tells them that she willingly helped Alexander, she helped lure the girl, she helped dispose of the bodies, and yet she pled not guilty. Like, make it make sense. Lyudmila, what are you on about, hun? Anyway, she would be charged. She was sentenced to 13 years in prison, which I don't think's enough. Personally, for me, I think she should have received the maximum penalty. But this woman, she would serve her term and she would be released in 2008. She now lives with her daughter off in the countryside, far removed from the very horrors that she facilitated. Alexander's sister, on the other hand, she was recognised as a witness and received no punishment. And yet she witnessed these young girls being tortured and abused and seen the mutilation of their bodies, and yet didn't report them. But somehow she's just a witness. What? In Novokuznetsk, Alexander and Lyudmila, they were able to carry out crimes so heinous and so preventable. They thrived in the cracks of negligence, feeding on oversight until the horror became impossible to ignore. And although some justice was served in part, that is never enough. It can't restore the lives that were stolen, the innocence that was shattered, or the trauma endured by some survivors, or the families left behind. When we sit down and when we recount the terror, when we acknowledge the victims, even when we study the failures of the systems, we remind ourselves that monsters, they don't always emerge from isolation. Sometimes they have this perfect storm of enablers behind them. And for the victims of Alexander, that storm arrived fully and without mercy. As said earlier, I have been able to find a list of some of the victims. I will say that I don't have all the names, but I found as many as I possibly could, and unfortunately some of his victims do remain unidentified to this very day, which, I mean, it's just heartbreaking. It's devastating, and I can't even imagine how some families out there feel, knowing that their loved one never got the justice that they deserved, not knowing what actually had happened to their loved one, if their loved one was a victim. Before I go through the names of the victims, I do just want to say that this video is made to memorialise the victims, to share their stories, and if we have to sit uncomfortably for the best part of an hour, I think it's the least we could do after all that they went through. I am sending love and prayer to the family members, to the friends of these victims, to the victims themselves, and I hope that wherever they are resting peacefully. So these are the names I found of the victims. So we've got Yevgenia Guselnikova, Elena Tronova, Elena Kotkina, Alexander Nosovets, Olga Nosovets, Dmitry Vorobyov, Irina Vorobyova, Elena Shakova, Natalia Voynova, Shatalina Galina, Svetseva Olga, Anastasia Berneva, and Yevgenia Barashkina. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. I do hope this one was interesting. I hope you learned something new. Maybe it was a completely new case to some of you, which, as you know, I always like to bring lesser known cases and lesser covered or completely uncovered cases that no one else really talks about, because I think it's so important to memorialise all victims that we possibly can, to speak their stories, to say their truth, and to remember them. If you do enjoy my content, please don't leave this video before subscribing and get the notification bell on. Please don't forget to hype up this video. It would honestly mean the entire world to me. We just hit 29,000, which is freaking insane. Like, we're so close to 30, so if we can keep pushing me out to that algorithm, let's do it as a team. And I'm so forever grateful that some of you sit down with me every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday and you give me an hour of your time to go through these cases and tell these stories. It's honestly incredible, this community that we've built. Don't forget, any details you need regarding me, myself and I, they will all be listed down below in the description. That'll be my social media handles, my TikTok, my Instagram, also products that I've used on my face today, in case you are, in case you're interested. Don't forget to leave your case suggestions in the comments down below. I go through them all, they all get added to my big list, and I do eventually get around to covering them. But I think that is it for today. Please, please, please remember, be a good person, do not be a bad person, stay safe, look after each other, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!